The millionaire walked into a cafe and saw his ex-wife with whom he broke up 25 years ago. But when he saw who was sitting next to her, the air outside was crisp, the late autumn breeze hinting at the arrival of winter. Mark Kensington barely noticed as he strode down the bustling city street, his steps brisk and purposeful. His mind was a constant buzz of figures and projections, his thoughts layered in plans, strategies, and ambitious goals. Mark Kensington, the millionaire, self-made, highly respected, and sharply dressed in tailored suits, rarely had a moment when he wasn't thinking about the next big deal or the next profit margin. This morning, however, he'd found himself with a rare free moment between meetings. A small, quaint cafe with warm lights spilling out into the street caught his attention. It wasn't his usual style. He preferred upscale lounges or chic restaurants with high ceilings and polished marble floors. But something about the simple charm of this cafe called to him, offering a pause from his frenetic world. After a moment's hesitation, he decided to step inside, seeking a quick reprieve from his demanding schedule. As he pushed open the door, a delicate chime echoed softly, and he was greeted by the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the faint hum of quiet chatter. The place was modest, cozy even, with shelves lined with books and walls decorated with mismatched art. A warm sense of nostalgia seeped into his chest, catching him off guard. Mark moved to the counter, ordering a black coffee with a swift, practiced ease, his gaze briefly flicking over the small crowd. He was alone, wrapped in his bubble of wealth and influence, disconnected from the mundane lives that filled the room. It was almost refreshing, this fleeting anonymity. People here didn't recognize him, didn't whisper in awe or glance his way, awed by his expensive watch or his tailored coat. Here he was just another customer, simply a man in need of caffeine. As he collected his coffee, he found a table near the window, setting down his cup and pulling out his phone. His fingers instinctively moved to check his email. There was always another deal, another negotiation to examine. And yet, something urged him to pause, to set his phone down, just for a moment, and let himself relax. He watched people passing by outside, each a stranger with their own world of worries and dreams. It was strange how distant he felt from such simple things. Despite his wealth, or perhaps because of it, he felt an odd emptiness creeping in, an ache he didn't care to examine. He pushed it aside, deciding that he needed to center his thoughts. He'd built a life of unparalleled success, amassed a fortune most could only dream of, and yet. He took a deep sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth, letting it distract him. He reminded himself that he was here to take a breath, not to sink into brooding reflections. The cafe was filling up, more people gathering in groups or pairs, the sound of quiet laughter and murmured conversations weaving around him. He absently wondered what it would be like to be part of that world again, the one he left behind all those years ago. Not that he'd give up the life he'd built, of course, but sometimes the little things seemed appealing, if only for a moment. He glanced around the room, almost unconsciously, and then his gaze froze. Across the cafe, sitting by the window with a soft, serene smile on her face, was a woman he never expected to see again. His heart gave a sudden, sharp twist as recognition struck him. It was Lisa. The memories, buried under layers of time and ambition, suddenly flooded back, surfacing with a painful clarity. 25 years, a whole lifetime since he'd last seen her. And yet, there she was, as if no time had passed at all. Mark's hand tightened around his coffee cup. He was on the edge of something he didn't yet understand, something he couldn't turn away from. Mark's pulse quickened as he took in the woman across the room. Lisa looked different. More mature, of course, yet there was an undeniable grace about her, something he hadn't noticed back then, or perhaps he hadn't taken the time to see. She looked poised, comfortable, her eyes bright with a warmth that pulled him back to a time when things were simpler, when his days weren't governed by meetings and spreadsheets. But the shock of seeing Lisa wasn't what held his attention entirely. It was the person sitting beside her. A young man was seated at her table, leaning forward with an easy smile, as if they were sharing some private joke. The resemblance was undeniable. His hair, thick and dark like Mark's had once been, and his profile, with sharp angles that stirred something painfully familiar within him. He watched the young man laugh, saw the way Lisa's eyes crinkled as she joined in, their shared expressions casting a warmth over the scene, enveloping them in an intimate world of their own. Mark's mind raced as he tried to process what he was seeing. Was this her son? Their son? The thought sent an unexpected pang through him, a strange blend of regret and curiosity. His memory sifted through the details of their past. Had she ever mentioned being pregnant? Had he left without knowing? Back then he'd been so consumed by his career, so driven by the singular focus of making it big. Lisa had always supported him, cheering on his successes, helping him through setbacks. But he'd given little in return. He hadn't noticed her sadness, her growing loneliness, until it was too late. The dreams of a family, a future together, had been something he'd told himself he'd get to, eventually. And then she'd left. He'd told himself he was fine, that it was a natural casualty of his success. They wanted different things, he reasoned, and she hadn't been able to handle his ambition. Over the years, he'd silenced the lingering guilt with work, with wealth, drowning out any whispers of remorse with all the trappings of luxury. But now, watching her across the room, the reality of his choices struck him. Here she was, living her life, and beside her was a young man who looked so much like the reflection he used to see in the mirror. Questions filled his mind. Was this young man his son? Had he truly missed out on knowing his own child? An impulse seized him, an urge to stand up and walk over to demand answers. But a strange fear held him back, a fear he hadn't felt in years. He was used to being in control, accustomed to command and respect. Yet here in this small cafe, the sight of his ex-wife with this young man left him feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced since his youth. He wanted to know who this young man was. He wanted to know what Lisa had done with her life, how she'd moved on, and why she'd never reached out. But could he even face her? After all this time, what right did he have to barge into her world and disrupt the life she'd built without him? He took another deep breath, steadying himself as he fought the urge to approach her. What would he even say? The words seemed to tangle in his mind, the magnitude of his emotions too intense to sort through. He was a stranger in her life now, and she too was a stranger in his. But the longer he sat there, the stronger his curiosity grew. And with it, the faint, painful stirrings of regret. 25 years ago, Mark was a different man. Hungry, ambitious, and brimming with dreams of success. He and Lisa had met on a warm summer evening at a small neighborhood gathering, introduced by a mutual friend who'd been confident they'd hit it off. And indeed, from the moment Mark saw her, he was captivated. Lisa had a lightness about her, a way of bringing warmth and laughter to any room she entered, a kindness that softened his sharp edges. Where Mark saw goals and numbers, Lisa saw beauty and meaning, encouraging him to look beyond his rigid plans. Their relationship blossomed quickly. In those early days, they spent long, carefree nights under city lights, sharing their dreams and aspirations. Lisa was an artist at heart, working as a teacher in a local school while painting in her spare time. She spoke passionately of her students and the difference she wanted to make, and Mark had admired her for it. Though he didn't fully understand her passion, he saw the joy it brought her, and that was enough. Together, they had painted an idyllic picture of the life they would someday share, one filled with love, laughter, and the possibility of children. For a time, Mark allowed himself to dream of a life that went beyond his career. He even considered slowing down, something that felt foreign to him, just to savor their moments together. They talked about buying a house with a big yard and planting a garden. Lisa wanted a dog. Mark wanted a cat. They'd laugh about the small things and argue playfully about how they'd decorate. He loved those nights when they planned their future as if they had all the time in the world. But as his career gained momentum, so did his ambition. His company was growing and he was moving up the ladder fast. Promotions, raises, and opportunities came rolling in, each one more demanding than the last. Soon he was working late hours and traveling frequently. Lisa's quiet dinners at home became lonely as his work consumed more of his time and energy. When she tried to talk to him about it, he would reassure her, saying it was all for their future. The sacrifices, he insisted, were only temporary. First, Lisa believed him. She encouraged him, always cheering him on. She was his biggest supporter, helping him prepare for meetings, making his favorite meals when he came home late, leaving notes in his suitcase when he traveled. She'd always been his grounding force, his reminder that life was about more than titles and money. But he hadn't listened closely enough. He thought he had forever to make up for the long nights, the missed anniversaries, the moments that slipped through his fingers. The love they shared, though deep, was increasingly stretched thin by the demands of his career. And soon, the dreams they'd once woven together began to feel like distant memories. Lisa's laughter became a rare sound, her smile dimmer with each passing day. He noticed the changes, but instead of addressing them, he buried himself deeper in work, chasing the success he believed would bring them both happiness in the end. In his mind, he had convinced himself that she understood, that she shared his vision of success, that she'd wait until he could finally give her the life he promised. But looking back now, he realized that while he had been running toward his future, she had been left behind, holding on to a love that he'd thought would endure any distance. Mark closed his eyes, the cafe fading around him as he let himself linger in the memory of those days when love had felt limitless and unbreakable. The cracks in their relationship began as small, nearly imperceptible shifts. Lisa would wait up for Mark, her dinner growing cold as the hours ticked by, and he'd come home exhausted, too tired to notice her disappointment. Gradually, those quiet dinners turned into nights where she ate alone, falling asleep before he ever walked through the door. She tried to tell him how she felt, but he'd brush her concerns aside, saying it was all part of building a better future. Every time she expressed her loneliness, he'd reassure her that success required sacrifice, that everything he was doing was for them. But Lisa wasn't convinced. She longed for the simple moments they'd shared in the beginning, the laughter, the easy companionship, the certainty that he cared more about their happiness than any business deal. It hurt her to see him slipping further into his work, his gaze more often fixed on his phone or laptop than on her. She'd watched as the man she'd loved slowly transformed, his warmth and spontaneity replaced by a cold, singular focus on ambition. As time passed, her efforts to reach him became less frequent. The artist in her, once vibrant and inspired, felt suffocated by the emptiness that filled their home. She began staying later at her school, spending more time with her students, filling her life with purpose where she could. She found solace in her art, pouring her emotions onto the canvas in bold, expressive strokes, painting the things she couldn't bring herself to say. Their conversations dwindled to little more than routine exchanges. The love they'd once had, the one filled with whispered promises and hopeful dreams, was replaced by a hollow coexistence, like roommates rather than partners. Mark rarely noticed the silent erosion of their relationship, and even when he did, he convinced himself that it was temporary, that she'd understand once he reached the top. Then came the night that changed everything. It had been their anniversary, a date Lisa had marked in her calendar for months. She spent the entire afternoon preparing a special dinner, wearing a dress she knew he'd once loved, and setting the table with their best china. She waited, her heart heavy with hope that perhaps tonight he'd remember, that he'd walk through the door with flowers, or at least a smile that told her he still cared. But as the hours passed, her hope faded, replaced by a painful certainty. When he finally walked in, his face tired and preoccupied, he barely looked at her before muttering a quick apology. He'd forgotten their anniversary. In that moment, something within Lisa broke. She looked at him, standing there in his tailored suit, the man she'd once adored, and realized he was already gone, lost to a world that she would never belong to. She wanted to scream, to tell him that she couldn't keep waiting, that she was tired of loving a shadow, but the words felt pointless, drained of meaning by all the times he hadn't heard her before. The next morning, Lisa packed her things. She left a note, simple and direct, telling him she couldn't do it anymore. She needed a life with meaning, a life where she didn't feel invisible. She couldn't be with someone who was always chasing something just out of reach, who saw her as little more than an accessory to his success. When Mark found the note, he'd stared at it in disbelief. His initial reaction was anger, but deep down, he felt something more unsettling, a hollow ache that hinted at the consequences of his choices. And yet, even then, he brushed it aside, telling himself he was better off without her distractions. But now, sitting in the cafe, all those old emotions flooded back, sharp and unrelenting. He could no longer ignore the truth. He had lost Lisa because he had chosen ambition over love, and the cost of that choice was sitting across from him, a young man who might be his son, a stranger to him because he'd let the one person who mattered slip through his fingers. Mark watched Lisa from across the cafe, hardly able to believe she was real. The years had added a quiet elegance to her, an aura of calm and assurance that he didn't remember from their past. She looked different in ways he couldn't pinpoint. Her posture more upright, her movements more deliberate. Gone was the young, hopeful girl who had once believed in him unconditionally, who had trusted him with her dreams and her heart. In her place was a woman who seemed entirely self-possessed, as if she had long ago stopped seeking approval or reassurance from anyone. He found himself captivated, unable to look away. Every subtle gesture, every shift in her expression, seemed loaded with meaning, and he felt the weight of all the things he'd missed. For a moment, he tried to imagine what her life must have been like after he left it. How had she managed alone? He knew she'd moved on. It was clear from the way she carried herself. She seemed fulfilled, as if she'd found something deeper, something he still hadn't grasped. Mark noticed small details about her that he'd forgotten over the years. The way she tilted her head when she listened, the light that danced in her eyes when she smiled, the laugh lines around her mouth, the traces of age on her skin. They only seemed to enhance her beauty. She was no longer the young woman he'd known, but she was somehow more than that, as though time had distilled her into a clearer, more resilient version of herself. As he continued to watch her, he couldn't shake the feeling of loss creeping up on him. This was the woman he'd once dreamed of sharing a life with, the woman he'd envisioned by his side through every success, every triumph. In his mind, they were supposed to have grown old together, to have celebrated life's milestones with each other. But instead, he'd chased a different vision, one built on wealth and prestige, and in doing so, he'd abandoned a life that could have been filled with love and companionship. She didn't appear bitter or resentful, and for some reason that surprised him. He had expected, perhaps even hoped, that she'd be angry, that she'd harbor a trace of the hurt he'd left behind. But instead she seemed free, content in a way that made him realize just how shackled he still was to the material things he'd once thought mattered. Watching her now, he couldn't help but wonder if she'd found the happiness that had eluded him, the peace he'd sacrificed in his pursuit of success. A wave of emotions washed over him. Jealousy, admiration, even something that felt painfully close to envy. It was as if she had stepped into the life they'd once dreamed of, but without him, and she'd built it into something rich and meaningful, something that went far beyond the wealth he'd amassed. His success felt hollow in comparison, stripped of the significance he'd once assigned to it. And that young man beside her. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching the family he'd lost. The family that, had he chosen differently, he might have shared. A sense of profound regret settled over him, bringing with it the realization that all his achievements, all his millions, couldn't fill the empty space left by the life he'd abandoned. She had moved on, that much was clear. She was no longer his Lisa. She had become her own person, untethered from his influence. And he, a stranger now, could only look on from afar, feeling as though he were watching a version of his life he would never know. Mark's gaze shifted to the young man sitting across from Lisa, who was now talking animatedly, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. The man was in his early 20s, with a lean build and a youthful energy that radiated confidence and ease. There was something unmistakably familiar about him, an intensity in his eyes, the way he leaned forward when he spoke, as if he were passionately invested in every word he said. It was like watching a younger version of himself, And that realization hit Mark with a force he hadn't anticipated. He tried to piece together the young man's story, wondering about the life he'd led, the life he might have shared with him had things been different. Was this Lisa's son? Their son? The resemblance was undeniable, and Mark felt a surge of emotion, part pride, part sorrow. Here was a young man with so much potential, someone who might have inherited both his drive and Lisa's warmth, a combination that felt achingly bittersweet. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt truly connected to someone, and in this young man, he saw a glimpse of a connection that had been taken from him. All those years he'd spent alone, thinking he was making the right sacrifices, climbing higher on the ladder of success. Only now he realized what he'd sacrificed in return. And here, right before his eyes, was a young man who seemed to embody everything he'd once valued but had ultimately forsaken. Family, connection, and a sense of belonging. Mark's thoughts spiraled as he watched them. How much did this young man know about him, if anything? Had Lisa ever mentioned him? Did this young man even know he had a father who had once loved Lisa fiercely, who had dreamed of building a life with her before letting it all slip away? The questions gnawed at him, stirring up regrets he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. And yet, beyond the regret, there was a deep, unexpected longing, to know him, to reach out and introduce himself, to tell him that he mattered. He could feel an unfamiliar ache in his chest, a vulnerability that frightened him. For a man who prided himself on control, on never letting his emotions cloud his judgment, this overwhelming wave of longing and regret was almost unbearable. As Lisa laughed at something the young man said, Mark's mind wrestled with the reality of the scene before him. This young man wasn't just a stranger. He might be his son, the child he'd never known, a person who had grown up without his influence, without his presence. All the moments they could have shared, first steps, first words, birthday parties, and late-night conversations, had unfolded without him. A sharp pang of jealousy coursed through him. He felt envious of all the people who had known this young man, who had shared in his joys and triumphs, watched him grow into the person he was today. That life could have been his, if only he'd made different choices, if only he'd valued what truly mattered before it was too late. The cafe, once a mere stop on his busy day, had become a window into a life he could never reclaim. He felt like an outsider, watching the world he'd once taken for granted, now moving forward without him. And sitting beside Lisa, the young man radiated a happiness and ease that told Mark he was loved, that he'd grown up in a world filled with warmth and belonging, the kind of world Mark had once dreamed of building with her. He took a deep breath, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. His coffee had grown cold, but he didn't care. He was no longer the man he'd thought he was. He was just a father who'd lost his way, watching from the sidelines as the life he'd left behind continued on, stronger and fuller than he'd ever imagined. Mark's gaze remained locked on the young man's face, his mind racing as he took in the undeniable familiarity of his features. There was no mistaking it now. The strong jawline, the slight arch of his eyebrows, the quiet intensity in his eyes. Mark's heart clenched as the realization dawned on him fully. This was his son. His son, whom he had never met, never even known existed until this moment. He felt a surge of conflicting emotions, pride, grief, and an aching sense of loss that made it hard to breathe. His son looked so much like him, and yet, he was a complete stranger. All the moments he'd missed washed over him in an agonizing wave. He thought of the milestones he'd never been a part of. The first words, the first day of school, the small, everyday victories and defeats that shaped a child into the person they would become. He'd missed it all, traded it all for the empire he'd built brick by brick, a fortress of wealth that now felt cold and hollow. Mark's mind drifted back to those early days with Lisa, the dreams they'd once had of a family, a future built together. He remembered the way she used to talk about wanting children, how she'd described the kind of mother she wanted to be. He had brushed her words aside back then, too focused on his ambitions to really listen, to understand the depth of her desires. Now, as he watched his son, a young man he barely knew, Mark felt the weight of all those missed conversations, all the dreams he'd let slip away in pursuit of his own goals. He'd believed he was building something meaningful, something that would make him feel complete. But now, faced with the reality of his son, he realized just how empty his achievements felt. A pang of guilt rose within him, sharp and relentless. He'd left Lisa to carry on without him, to raise their son alone. What kind of man does that? He wondered, his own image of himself as a proud, successful millionaire crumbling in the face of this newfound understanding. He felt like a stranger to himself, ashamed of the choices he'd made, the life he'd valued over family. But along with the guilt, there was something else, a glimmer of hope, fragile but unmistakable. He felt an urge to know his son, to bridge the chasm that separated them, to somehow make up for the years he'd lost. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew he couldn't simply step into this young man's life and expect things to fall into place. But the desire was there, a deep, unshakable need to reconnect, to build something real with him if he would allow it. As he continued to watch them, Mark noticed the way Lisa looked at their son, with pride, with love, with a tenderness that spoke of years of devotion and sacrifice. He realized then the full extent of what he had missed. He had spent years chasing success, believing it would bring him happiness, fulfillment. But seeing his son now, he understood that true success lay in the very thing he had abandoned. A knot formed in his throat as he wondered if there was still a chance, if he could somehow forge a relationship with his son despite all the lost years. He didn't know how to begin, what words to say, or how to face the resentment that might await him. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away this time. He couldn't leave without trying, without at least telling his son who he was, and why he hadn't been there. Mark braced himself, heart pounding, as he contemplated the steps he would take. For the first time in years, he felt fear. Fear of rejection, of facing the consequences of his choices, of stepping into a world he had chosen to abandon. As Mark sat there, a wave of guilt crashed over him, sharp and unrelenting, as he confronted the harsh reality of his choices. The wealth, the power, the luxury, all those things he'd spent a lifetime accumulating, now felt painfully insignificant compared to the bond he'd lost. The weight of his decisions settled heavily on his shoulders, and he felt as if he were seeing his life clearly for the first time. Every dollar he'd earned, every deal he'd closed, each step toward his meticulously crafted success felt empty when compared to the young man before him, the son he'd never known. It was a realization that sent a chill through him, an awareness that struck at the core of who he was. What he had considered triumphs were, in the harsh light of hindsight, hollow victories. And the price he'd paid for them was a life filled with empty achievements, leaving him estranged from the one thing that could have truly mattered. He remembered with painful clarity the times he'd chosen work over the possibility of family, the moments when he'd told himself he was too busy to worry about relationships. He'd silenced any misgivings, convincing himself that his success would be worth it in the end. But now, sitting alone, watching his son and his ex-wife share a quiet laugh, he felt the devastating truth. He had been wrong. Success hadn't filled the void, hadn't given him the sense of purpose or fulfillment he'd expected. It had only widened the chasm within him. Images flashed through his mind, moments he had missed, glimpses of the life he might have had. He imagined what it might have been like to hold his son for the first time, to see him grow, to teach him the things he'd learned. He pictured birthdays, holidays, simple afternoons spent together, memories he'd never made, moments he'd lost forever. It was an unbearable thought, realizing that he had turned his back on all of it without even knowing what he was giving up. The hardest part was the recognition of Lisa's strength, her resilience in raising their son alone. She had become everything he hadn't, patient, loving, devoted. Watching her now, he could see how her love and care had shaped their son into a confident, joyful young man. She had done what he had failed to do. She had prioritized what truly mattered, while he had chosen ambition over love, success over family. Regret settled over him, heavy and unyielding like a stone in his chest. He wondered if he even had the right to feel this way, to wish for a connection that he had walked away from. What kind of father abandons his child before he even knows him? What kind of man sacrifices his family at the altar of ambition? He could feel his shame growing, a dark shadow that seemed to encompass him entirely. For the first time, he saw himself not as the successful, powerful man he had believed himself to be, but as a flawed, deeply lonely person who had let the most important things slip through his fingers. He felt small, broken, undeserving of the love he had forfeited, and he wondered if it was even possible to make amends. Could he ask his son to forgive him for years of absence? Could he face Lisa, knowing how deeply he had hurt her? A part of him wanted to turn and walk out of the cafe, to leave before he risked exposing himself, before he faced the reality of the family he had abandoned. But a stronger part of him, the part that felt the overwhelming pull of love, a love he hadn't realized until now, kept him rooted to his seat. He couldn't leave. He had to try, no matter the cost, no matter how painful it might be. As he took a shaky breath, Mark knew there was only one path forward, and it was one he should have taken years ago. He would gather his courage and confront the family he had lost. This was his moment to at least try, to finally choose love over ambition, no matter where it led him. Mark's heart raced as he rose from his seat, the weight of decades pressing on him as he took slow, deliberate steps toward the table where Lisa and his son sat. The bustling sounds of the cafe faded, leaving him in a silence that was somehow more intense, more deafening. This wasn't a business meeting, a negotiation, or a performance review. This was real, raw, and utterly vulnerable. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure of whether he was about to fall or finally take flight. As he approached, he caught a few fragments of their conversation. The young man, Alex, he learned from Lisa's laugh, was animatedly sharing a story, his hands moving expressively, eyes alight with excitement. And Lisa, gazing at him with a look of quiet pride, nodded along, her smile tender and understanding. It was a scene of perfect simplicity, an unguarded moment that spoke of years of shared memories and love. Mark felt like an intruder, an outsider in the life they'd built without him. He hesitated, his mind scrambling for the right words, the right way to bridge the gap he'd created all those years ago. But no words seemed adequate. How could he, in a single conversation, make up for years of absence, for the choices that had kept him from knowing his own son? He took a deep breath, forcing himself to take the final steps toward their table, his heart pounding as he drew closer. Lisa noticed him first. Her expression shifted from one of contentment to surprise, her eyes widening as she recognized him. He saw a flash of emotions pass across her face. Shock, confusion, perhaps even a hint of anger. But there was something else too, a lingering softness, a faint echo of the connection they'd once shared. She recovered quickly, her face settling into an unreadable expression, as if she were preparing herself for whatever was to come. Alex looked up then, following his mother's gaze, his bright eyes curious as he took in the stranger standing before them. Mark could see the flicker of recognition in his son's face, as if something about him seemed familiar. It was a strange moment, the silence between them filled with a tension that neither Mark nor Alex fully understood. "Lisa," Mark managed, his voice quieter than he intended, weighted with the emotions he couldn't quite put into words. He struggled to keep his composure, the vulnerability raw and unfamiliar. "Hey, I didn't expect to see you here." Lisa's eyes remained steady, assessing him, and Mark could feel her holding back. He could tell she was searching for the right words, perhaps battling her own emotions. She looked from Mark to Alex and then back, her expression softening just slightly, as though she recognized the fragility of the moment. "This is unexpected," she said, her voice calm but with a hint of steel. "Mark, what are you doing here?" He cleared his throat, feeling exposed under her steady gaze. He glanced at Alex, who was watching him with a mixture of curiosity and caution, the faint lines of confusion on his young face. I didn't know I'd see you today," Mark admitted, his voice rough. He felt foolish for not having a better answer, but he pushed forward, realizing this might be the only chance he'd have. I saw you both and I wanted to come over. To introduce myself. He looked directly at Alex, swallowing the emotions that threatened to choke him. My name is Mark Kensington. And I believe I'm your father. The words hung in the air, a raw confession that left Alex's eyes wide with shock. Lisa's mouth slightly parted as she took a slow, deep breath. It was a moment suspended in time, fragile and heavy with the possibility of both forgiveness and rejection. For a long moment, the silence between them was absolute, filled only by the soft background hum of the cafe. Mark could see the surprise etched on Alex's face, his brows furrowing as he looked to Lisa for confirmation. Lisa, steady and calm as always, held her son's gaze, then turned to Mark with an expression that was both resigned and wary. Alex, Lisa began softly, her voice as gentle as he remembered. This is Mark. He's the man I told you about. She paused, as if searching for the right words. Your father. Alex blinked, his expression unreadable as he took in the revelation. Mark could see the flicker of emotions in his son's eyes. Curiosity, confusion, maybe even a hint of anger. Alex took a deep breath, crossing his arms as he finally looked back at Mark, sizing him up. You're my father? Alex asked, his tone a mixture of disbelief and guarded emotion. I've gone my whole life without hearing from you. Why are you here now? The question, simple yet devastating, hit Mark like a punch. He had expected it, prepared for it even, but the bluntness of it still left him grasping for a response. How could he begin to explain the years of silence, the choices that had led him down a different path? He could feel the weight of his own guilt, the regrets that had festered over decades, but he forced himself to meet his son's gaze, unwilling to look away. Alex, I don't have an excuse, Mark began, his voice cracking slightly. There's nothing I can say to justify why I wasn't there for you. I made choices I thought were important, but I can see now how wrong I was. I'm here because I saw you and I couldn't just walk away. I couldn't keep pretending I hadn't made a mistake. He glanced at Lisa, who was watching him with an expression that held both sadness and understanding. She nodded slightly, as if urging him to continue. Mark took a steadying breath, feeling the vulnerability of his words, knowing they might be too little too late. I know this doesn't make up for anything, Mark continued, his voice thick with emotion. I know I missed everything, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that I wasn't there for you, that I left Lisa to do this on her own. But I want to try if you'll let me. I want to know you, to be in your life. If you want me to. Alex's expression softened, though his posture remained guarded. He exchanged a glance with his mother, as though seeking her input, her reassurance. Lisa gave him a small, encouraging nod, her hand reaching across the table to give his a gentle squeeze. Mark felt his chest tighten as he watched the small exchange, the quiet intimacy between mother and son that he had never been a part of. He realized in that moment just how much Lisa had given to their son, the sacrifices she'd made to ensure he felt loved, secure and whole. Alex turned back to Mark, studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never felt before. I don't know you, Alex said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that belied his years. But I do know how much my mom did for me. She's been there for everything. And part of me resents you for not being there. But he paused, glancing at his mother, who nodded gently. I think I'd like to get to know you, Alex said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. But it'll take time. And it has to be real. I don't want you to just show up and disappear. Mark's throat tightened with emotion. He nodded, his voice rough as he replied, I promise. I'll do whatever it takes. I know I can't erase the past, but I'll do everything I can to be here now. I won't let you down again. A flicker of understanding passed between them, tentative and fragile but real. And for the first time in years, Mark felt a glimmer of hope, a chance for redemption, a possibility to rebuild what he had lost, brick by careful brick. After their conversation, Mark left the cafe feeling like he'd shed the weight of years in a single afternoon. He strolled slowly through the streets, the bustling city around him fading as he reflected on all that had happened. A whirlwind of emotions churned within him. Relief, hope, but also a deep sadness for the time he had lost and could never regain. He realized that for all his achievements, the life he'd built had been one-dimensional, a world filled with material wealth but devoid of the true connections that made life meaningful. He thought of Lisa's face, her calm, patient expression as she had listened to him. She had every right to be angry, to shut him out, to tell him that he was too late, that the door had closed long ago. And yet she had allowed him a chance, not just with Alex but with her as well. Her forgiveness, however tentative, had been like a salve to the wounds he hadn't even known he carried. It had shown him a glimpse of the life he could have led if he'd chosen differently, if he had valued love and family as much as he had once valued his career. A pang of regret twisted in his chest as he wondered what it would have been like to build a family, to share the simple, unremarkable moments of everyday life. His son's milestones, first steps, scraped knees, late-night talks, each one a memory he would never have, a part of Alex's life he could never reclaim. But he could start now. He could begin to mend what was left, even if the process was slow and uncertain. For the first time, Mark let himself face the pain and loneliness he'd been ignoring, the consequences of having lived so far removed from what truly mattered. He saw the irony in his life, the paradox of having everything he thought he wanted, yet feeling emptier than ever before. He'd spent years convincing himself that success was the only thing that mattered, that love and family were distractions he could return to later. Now he understood how deeply wrong he had been. The mansion, the luxury cars, the high-rise office, they were shadows, hollow achievements compared to the love he had so carelessly abandoned. He took a seat on a nearby bench, staring out at the city skyline, his thoughts slowly coalescing into a kind of clarity he'd never experienced. His wealth could never buy back the lost years, nor could it repair the wounds he'd inflicted. But perhaps he could still build something new. Something grounded in humility, gratitude, and a genuine desire to be present in the lives of those he loved. He wanted to know his son, to be there for him, to support him in the ways he hadn't before. He wanted to share in Alex's dreams, to be someone his son could look up to, not as a distant figure of wealth, but as a father who cared deeply. Mark knew the journey ahead would be challenging, filled with moments of vulnerability he had once avoided. But he was willing to face those fears, to bear the pain of accountability if it meant he could build a real connection with Alex. His heart felt raw, open, but it was a feeling he welcomed. For the first time in years he felt alive, connected to something beyond himself. As he sat in the fading light of the city, he made a promise to himself. He would not let this chance slip away. He would become the father Alex deserved, the man he himself could be proud of. And though the road would be long, he felt the first stirrings of a new purpose, one far richer than any achievement he'd ever known. The days following that fateful afternoon at the cafe marked the beginning of a journey unlike any Mark had ever taken. Each morning, he rose with a renewed sense of purpose, yet the path ahead was fragile, paved with both anticipation and an underlying fear that his son might find his efforts too little too late. Every day, he wrestled with the fear of rejection, the worry that he might not be able to make amends for all the lost years. Yet he knew that rebuilding a relationship with Alex would take patience, humility, and a genuine openness that he'd never allowed himself to show before. With Lisa's help, he and Alex arranged a lunch date for the following week. When the day arrived, Mark found himself nervous, his mind racing with thoughts of what he should say, what he could possibly offer this young man he was only beginning to know. But as he watched Alex approach, carrying himself with an ease and confidence that reminded Mark of Lisa's grace, he felt an unexpected calm wash over him. This was his son, a stranger in many ways, yes, but someone with whom he now shared a deep and irrevocable bond. Their conversation was slow and cautious, but over the course of the afternoon, something remarkable began to happen. They shared stories, laughed at the awkwardness of the moment, and Mark found himself marveling at the person Alex had become. He listened intently as Alex spoke about his interests, his plans and his future, absorbing each detail with the reverence of someone granted a second chance. There was a bittersweetness in every word, every smile, but for the first time, Mark allowed himself to feel it fully without turning away. As their relationship grew, so did his connection with Lisa. She'd kept her distance at first, cautious, protective of the life she had built, and he couldn't blame her. But little by little, they began to find a new rhythm, a fragile but real friendship based on mutual respect and the love they both shared for their son. Mark came to understand that while he had been pursuing wealth and status, Lisa had been the true architect of their son's life, providing the warmth, stability, and support that Mark had once neglected. One evening, after dropping Alex off at his apartment, Mark found himself sitting in his car, contemplating all he'd experienced. He understood that there were things he couldn't change, memories he couldn't rewrite, but he felt a quiet hope stirring within him. Each moment spent with Alex, each conversation shared, was like a step toward redemption, a way to rebuild a bridge he had once carelessly burned. In time, Alex grew to trust him more, letting Mark into his life bit by bit. They shared dinners, caught movies, even took a weekend trip together, during which Mark saw glimpses of his younger self in Alex. Ambitious, driven, and full of dreams. But unlike Mark's younger self, Alex had something Mark had missed: a deep understanding of love, loyalty, and the importance of family. And Mark was grateful for that. Grateful that, despite his absence, Lisa had instilled these values in their son, creating a foundation that he could now build upon. Through it all, Mark realized that he was no longer striving to win back the family he'd lost, but rather to be worthy of the family that had allowed him back in. Redemption, he learned, wasn't something that could be achieved with grand gestures or sweeping apologies. It was found in the quiet, daily commitment to be present, to listen, to love with humility and grace. Years later, as he sat at a holiday gathering with Alex and Lisa, Mark felt a profound sense of peace. He'd come to understand that true wealth wasn't in his bank account or his portfolio, but in the laughter around him, the warmth of shared meals, the forgiveness that had allowed him back into this circle of love. Mark looked across the table at his son, who smiled back at him with a kindness he hadn't earned but was determined to repay. In that moment, he knew he'd been given the greatest gift of all: a second chance to love, to grow, and to finally be the man his family deserved.
"Stephanie, you've been at this for a while now. Mrs. Novak won't be pleased with us," said Jim, smiling at his daughter, who was fussing in front of the mirror. At just 5 years old, she carried herself with an unusual level of seriousness, which brought a constant smile to not just her father's face, but also to her caregivers. Mrs. Novak, her kindergarten teacher, would say that in all her years of experience, she had never seen such a unique child. Sometimes, Jim would come home tired, desiring some peace and quiet, but Stephanie would immediately sit down next to him and ask a question that she'd been contemplating for a while. "Dad, why do we dream?" she asked one day as soon as Jim settled on the couch. He smiled, sat her on his lap, and replied, "That's an excellent question, my little smarty. We dream because our brain never stops, even when we're sleeping, and it creates small stories and pictures that we see in our dreams." But Stephanie wasn't satisfied. "But why do we have different dreams? I dreamt about a princess, and Johnny from kindergarten said he saw himself on a spaceship." "Each person is unique, and we all have different thoughts and desires. Also, our brains show us things we learn during the day. That's why we have different dreams." "But what do brains do when we're awake and not dreaming?" And so it continued, until Jim completely forgot that he'd wanted to lie down with his eyes closed in complete silence just a few minutes ago. Ashley, Jim's wife and Stephanie's mother, sometimes said, "You know, dear, our daughter frightens me at times. Her reasoning is way beyond of a 5-year-old, and her questions sometimes leave me at a loss." Jim would just chuckle. "Honey, but this is a good thing. Look at her. She's only 5 and she's already won an award for her creativity, as if she's in school." It was true. Jim and Ashley were very proud of their little girl, and always paid attention to her wishes and opinions. In general, people around them, their friends, never ceased to admire Jim's family, holding them up as an example to all. It seemed as if nothing could break their strong bonds. However, as it usually happens, even in seemingly perfect lives, unexpected challenges and problems arise. Jim was lost in thought and almost drove past the kindergarten. He had plenty to think about. His beloved wife Ashley had been acting strangely over the past few weeks. She seemed scared, avoiding eye contact, as if she was hiding something from him. When asked if everything was okay, she would respond in a way that quickly changed the subject. It couldn't be that she wasn't telling him something, whether it was a small mishap or a big problem. They had always had a relationship based on trust. Jim and Ashley met back in university. They were both rushing to their first lecture and accidentally got stuck in one of the old, not very reliable elevators. Ashley was pressing the emergency buttons with hope, but nothing was happening. The young couple had to call their friends to notify the authorities. All they could do now was wait for help to arrive. It was unclear how long it would take, but they didn't get disheartened and started to joke around. Jim picked up an improvised microphone and with a presenter's voice began. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a very special episode of our TV show, where we're stuck in an elevator and have the most fascinating stories for you." Playing the role of a host, Jim asked Ashley, "How do you feel being here?" Ashley, who was on the verge of claustrophobia-induced panic attack, broke into laughter. It was clear that Jim's resourcefulness had somewhat relaxed her. Sensing she was still panicked, Jim himself answered the question in a feminine voice. "Oh, it's quite a romantic place for a date, but I'd prefer a rooftop restaurant." They laughed at the joke and continued to chat. Half an hour flew by like a couple of minutes. Finally, the elevator started moving. Jim and Ashley were free, and with a smile, they realized that this incident had led to a memorable encounter. From that day on, they became good friends and always reminisced about this amusing story. However, soon, Jim began to see more than just a friend in the beautiful girl. He admired her beauty, was in awe of her actions, and felt happy to be around her. It took him a while to confess his feelings, fearing that if she didn't reciprocate, he might lose their friendship. But it couldn't continue like this. One day, Jim decided to take the leap. He asked Ashley for a walk. She was surprised to see him holding a huge bouquet, but what impressed her even more were his words about being in love with her for quite a while. That day, Jim learned that she had been harboring the same feelings for him. They laughed and agreed from that day to keep no secrets from each other. They dated for a long time and got married right after graduating. They planned everything ahead and had Stephanie. Next on their plans was to open a small organic food store. They were saving money, and by the next year, they were supposed to start making their dream a reality. He loved Ashley, adored his daughter, and would do anything for them. At the same time, he knew Ashley would do the same. That's why her recent behavior alarmed and saddened him. He occasionally thought that Ashley might have another man, but he instantly dismissed such thoughts. It was too painful for him to even contemplate the past. Jim didn't want history to repeat itself, didn't want to relive the horrors of his parents' relationship. His family, the one he was brought up in, the one everyone around him considered perfect, was anything but that in reality. He vividly remembered that day as if it was yesterday. He had come home early from school because he was suffering from a throbbing headache and the teacher had allowed him to leave. Upon entering his house, he immediately heard the loud voices of his parents. Nervously, he walked into the living room and arrived just in time to witness his father hit his mother. She was knocked back onto the couch from the force of the blow, letting out a soft groan of pain. His father, with an ominous look on his face, moved toward her. Jim, without thinking, threw himself in between them. "Leave Mom alone!" was all the young boy could shout, holding back the tears that were threatening to spill out. The idea of such violence was so foreign to him, he simply couldn't comprehend it. His father paused in front of him, fists clenched. "She is to blame for everything. You'll understand this soon enough." But Jim didn't flinch. He stood there, between his mother and father, meeting his father's gaze unblinkingly. His father just waved him off and walked away, leaving his mother in tears. She cried, clutching Jim close to her, muttering incomprehensible words. Occasionally through her sobs, Jim caught phrases like, "I'm sorry, and you'll understand someday." Indeed, he did understand what his mother meant, but only years later. What followed was a painful divorce. His father, Walter Douglas, had a lot of connections. In court, he managed to gain custody of Jim. Furthermore, his father's lawyers painted his mother Natalie in such a negative light that the court barred her from coming near her son. In court, his mother wept, gripping his hands tightly, but Jim just stood silently. Not moving and not meeting her gaze, Walter told him that their mother had betrayed them, that she had another man, and that she had chosen him over them. The realization was painful, deeply hurtful, and bitter. As Jim grew older, he started to understand that things were not as simple as he had thought. His father was a cruel man. When he was small, he saw but did not attribute importance to many things. Frequently, his mother had bruises and cuts, which she would explain to him as accidents due to her clumsiness. Jim couldn't recall a time when his mother openly voiced her opinions or challenged his father. In recent times, she hardly ever smiled, except when she was alone with him. One day, while rummaging through old stuff in the storeroom, he came across a thin notebook. It revealed many events and circumstances of his mother's life. The moments she couldn't bear to keep inside were poured out in this written confession. From what he read, Jim deduced the following. Natalie, his mother, had endured her husband's harsh treatment with fortitude, always striving to be a good wife. From the beginning, she felt indebted to him. Early in their married life, Natalie had noticed Walter's despotic traits. He never tolerated objections, controlled everything in the house, forbade her from working, restricted her social interactions, and could lose his temper for any reason. The primary cause for his anger was jealousy. He was suspicious of every man around his wife. Natalie always believed that if he was jealous, it meant he loved her. Then Jim was born. His young mother transferred all her love and care to him. It all happened when she ended up in the hospital following yet another scandal stirred by her husband. Understandably, she didn't share the real reason behind it with anyone. Due to complications, she had to stay in the hospital for around 10 days. During this time, she was cared for by a young doctor who turned out to be sensitive, kind, and responsive. He showed interest and care for her, setting her apart from the rest of the patients. And so it happened. After a long period of neglect, lack of tender attention, and care, she became fond of this man. Initially, it was just innocent interaction. The doctor periodically called her, citing the need to monitor his patient's conditions. He gave professional advice, asked her to take care of herself. Then, during one of the follow-up visits, the doctor invited Natalie for coffee. Gradually, everything evolved into a romantic relationship. The man urged her to leave her husband and come to him as soon as possible. He even offered to confront her husband together. However, Natalie insisted on handling the situation herself. She didn't want to deceive Walter, but was fearful of his reaction. She also worried that her young son wouldn't understand. Nonetheless, she finally decided to confess. However, she could never have imagined that her husband would find out about everything much earlier. And so the inevitable happened. Jim now clearly understood how difficult it was for his mother in their home. He missed her and often asked his father about her whereabouts, only to be met with shouts. He resolved that once he became independent, he would definitely find her. But just as he turned 16, his father gave him a letter. It revealed that his mother was no more. Her sister had asked for Jim to be brought to the funeral, because Natalie missed him and kept repeating his name on the deathbed. However, the letter had been sent 2 weeks earlier. At first, Jim thought it was due to a postal delay, but then realized his father had deliberately held the letter back, making it pointless to attend. Jim never forgave his father for this act. As soon as he turned 18, he left his mother's diary in front of his father and hastily left the family home. After that, he didn't see him, only occasionally calling to check if he was okay, but their conversations never extended beyond formal inquiries. Neither man found the right words for each other, and their strained interaction always ended there. "Dad, didn't you forget we're heading to the daycare?" Jim snapped back to reality and stepped on the brakes. "Sorry, Stephanie, I was lost in thought." Stephanie raised her index finger. "Dad, you can't zone out behind the wheel, especially when there are kids in the car." He smiled. "Yes, I know, sweetheart. I promise it won't happen again." Stephanie, satisfied with the response, got out of the car. "Mrs. Novak," Jim signaled to the caregiver, who, nudging Stephanie towards the door, approached him. Stephanie was complaining about Daniel picking on the girls, and it seems she's planning to set things right. Could you please keep an eye on her? Jim bid her goodbye and headed to work. He had a tough day ahead, and in the evening, Ashley was picking up Stephanie. After breakfast, Stephanie, seeing Daniel, decided to settle their scores. Daniel was ready for the confrontation, and it escalated into a serious fight. By the time Mrs. Novak, the caretaker, could intervene and separate the two, The little girl had received a scrape on her nose. The injury was minor, but it upset her. "Let's go to our nurse. She can have a look," suggested Mrs. Novak. Stephanie agreed. She didn't want to look unattractive. Misty, the nurse, gave her a kind smile. She was only 3 days into this job at the daycare, but she was absolutely loving it. The work, the staff, and the children. "What's your name?" Misty asked. "Stephanie," the girl replied, studying the young nurse carefully. "And I know you," she added. Misty smiled. "Is that so? And from where?" "Your picture is in my dad's wallet." At this, Mrs. Novak raised an eyebrow, and Misty blushed in surprise. She didn't even have a boyfriend at the moment. She couldn't imagine whose wallet her picture might be in. "Stephanie, that can't be right," Mrs. Novak objected. "It's true, it's been there for a long time," Stephanie insisted. Misty looked helplessly at Mrs. Novak, but the older woman pursed her lips and looked at her with a hint of hostility. Mrs. Novak had always been a strong believer in family values and fidelity, and she immediately suspected Misty of having an affair with Jim. That evening, when Ashley came to pick up Stephanie and heard about the fight from the daycare teacher, Stephanie said, "Mom, Mrs. Novak didn't tell you everything." "Oh, what did she leave out?" Ashley asked, smiling at her daughter. "We have a new nurse, and her picture is in Dad's wallet." Ashley dropped her bag. She must have heard wrong. "What? Are you sure? That can't be true," she stammered. "It is, Mom. Haven't you seen it? Look, there she is." Stephanie pointed out Misty, who was leaving the daycare building and heading for the bus stop. A young, tall, beautiful woman. Ashley's heart clenched painfully. Scary thoughts began to flood her mind. She had been anxious, unsure of how to discuss certain news with her husband. Now, it seemed, there was no need for that conversation. She had assumed that this news would be significant to Jim. She had been gathering courage to tell him that she was pregnant. Despite Jim enthusiastically describing their future life together, Ashley did not want to follow their planned path. She really wanted this baby, and it seemed that this baby would be wanted only by her. Stephanie noticed the change in her mother's mood, but wisely kept quiet as they silently made their way home. Jim came home late from work. Oddly, Ashley didn't greet him. This had never happened before. Even when he returned in the middle of the night, his lightly sleeping wife would always stir and rise to meet him. But this time, silence. It only confirmed to him that something was off in their family. This needed to be addressed. His head swarmed with a hive of wild thoughts, and his heart was heavy. Quietly, he got into bed, aware that Ashley wasn't asleep. She was pretending to sleep quite convincingly, but he chose not to acknowledge it. He would wait until morning. If Ashley didn't want to talk now, he would respect her silence. But come morning, they would get to the bottom of this, whatever it was. They always figured things out, together. Morning came, and he woke up to the sound of commotion from the kitchen and his daughter's disgruntled voice. Blast! He had almost overslept. Stephanie was already pumping in front of the mirror, inspecting her scratch, while Ashley was in the kitchen. He walked in and sat down next to his daughter. "Sweetheart, what happened to your face? Don't tell me you ended up fighting with Daniel after all," he asked, letting out a sigh. "But now he will think twice before picking on anyone. Dad, how long will this scratch stay on my nose?" Stephanie looked up at him, clearly upset. Jim gave her a warm smile and gently kissed her on the nose. "Well, now it will heal much faster." He glanced at his wife. "Right, dear?" Ashley instantly turned to him and said sternly, "Jim, we need to talk." "I was about to suggest that. Let's talk," replied the man, still smiling, but doubt was already creeping into his heart. Ashley gave him a long look, then abruptly got up, ran out into the hallway, and returned with a clear file. "Here, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you this, where to start. I was scared of how you'd react. Anyway, I'm pregnant." Jim beamed for a moment, but quickly realized from his wife's expression that there was more. "I'm not planning on terminating the pregnancy. Yes, we didn't plan for this, but that's not important now. I know about you and your nurse." Taken aback by this unexpected twist, the husband blinked in confusion. "I don't understand. Repeat that? What nurse?" "What nurse?" Ashley rolled her eyes. "Oh, Jim, stop the charade. I've always trusted you. I thought you'd never betray me, but now I feel like a complete fool. How could you? As if it's not enough that you're cheating on me with a nurse from the kindergarten. Stephanie also said that you have her photos in your wallet. I've seen this girl, young, beautiful, at least 10 years younger than you. Of course, I guess I'm just not that attractive anymore. Jim closed his eyes and massaged his temples. His head ached from the overload of information. The joy of finding out he was going to have a baby was overshadowed by the context in which the news was delivered. What on earth does the nurse, who I've never even seen, have to do with anything? Honey, are you out of your mind? Have I ever given you a reason to doubt me? And I don't have any photos in my wallet. He bolted from the room. He brought back his wallet. He opened it. It contained credit cards, documents, money, a family photo of theirs, and behind it, a very old picture. Here, the only photos I have are ours and Mom's, that's all. Then Ashley and Jim exchanged a look, and then in unison said, Stephanie, could you come here? Their daughter came into the kitchen and gave her parents a strange look. She was scared. She'd never heard her mom and dad shout at each other like that. Stephanie, what photo were you talking about? The little girl pointed to the picture in her dad's hands. This one. It's our nurse. Jim and Ashley got dressed in 3 minutes, and within 5 were speeding in their car towards their daughter's nursery school. Truthfully, Jim couldn't understand how this could possibly be. His mother was dead, and that girl was very young. Ashley went to drop their daughter off at her group to then join Jim. He went straight to the medical section. Misty looked up in surprise as a grown man stormed in. Hello? Can I help you? Apparently, I need your help, he said, catching his breath after the run. I'm Stephanie's father. Misty suddenly remembered yesterday's incident. She felt extremely uncomfortable under the long, hard stare of the man. She was already standing up to escort the man out, but froze when she heard him ask, Excuse me, was your mother's name Natalie? Yes. What does all this mean? And how do you know my mother? The girl was utterly confused when the man suddenly broke into tears. His hands trembling, he pulled an old photo out of his pocket and placed it in front of her. He wiped his wet face with the back of his hand and softly said, She's my mother too. It seemed the man wanted to say more, but he just sank into a chair, not taking his eyes off her. Misty sat down too. The pause stretched on. The two of them sat in silence, looking at each other. Finally, Misty was the first to speak. But how? How could this be? I thought I would never meet my brother. I had given up all attempts to find you. Upon hearing her last words, the man perked up. You were looking for me? So Mom told you about me? How much did you know? Very little. Just your name, and later your address. But when I got there, I found a family who knew nothing about the previous owners. Just as he was about to ask more questions, there was a knock on the door, and his wife Ashley and Mrs. Novak walked in. Mrs. Novak clicked her tongue disapprovingly and gave Misty a chilling look. However, Jim didn't notice this as he quietly said to Misty, This is my wife Ashley. Ashley, this is my younger sister. The women stood in stunned silence. The corners of Ashley's lips raised ever so slightly, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Now that all the misunderstandings had been sorted out, they had the opportunity to talk. Jim had a million questions which he unloaded on his newfound sister. She smiled and began to tell her story from the beginning. Misty had been a bright and curious child. Her childhood was spent in a picturesque small town, surrounded by loving and caring parents. Her father worked as a doctor at the local hospital. Her mother managed their home and cultivated beautiful flowers in their garden. Misty loved watching her mother hum a gentle melody while tending to her garden, her face radiating absolute happiness. In the evenings when the family gathered for dinner, her father would always scoop Misty up in his arms and spin her around, her giggles filling the air. Then they would sit at the table, engaging in lively conversations over a delicious meal. However, sharp-eyed Misty occasionally noticed her mother drifting away in thought, recalling something sad and shedding tears when she thought no one was watching. When Misty asked about how her mother met her father, eager to hear the love story of her parents, her mother would only share bits and pieces, often stopping mid-sentence. She always skipped over the parts of her life before she met Misty's father. One day, while searching for a doll in the attic that her mother had put away the previous summer, Misty accidentally stumbled upon an old dusty box hidden behind a stack of books on a shelf. Inside the box were photographs, one of which featured a boy, strikingly similar to herself, in her mother's arms. Surprised by her discovery, she rushed to show her mother. "Mom, look what I found!" Misty placed the worn-out photographs in her mother's hand. Her mother took a glance at them and gasped, abruptly sitting down on a nearby chair. "Where did you find these, Misty?" "Up there in the attic. But who's this boy, Mom? He looks so much like me." Struggling to find her voice, her mother examined the photograph for a long time. Finally, she looked up and whispered, "The boy in the photograph is your older brother." After learning about her mother's history, the little girl hugged her and asked why she hadn't spoken about it earlier. Her mother gently stroked her hair. "I was always scared that if I told you about him, it would make your life harder. I wanted you to grow up in joy and love, not knowing sorrow and pain. But I couldn't imagine how wise my little girl has become, how grown up you are now." That was the first and last time Misty heard about the existence of her brother from her mother. Soon after, her parents were involved in a car accident. The driver of the oncoming vehicle had lost control. Her father managed to survive the crash, but her mother, despite fighting for several hours in the hospital, couldn't make it. Even after all these years, it was painful for Jim to hear about his mother's death. He asked Misty, "What happened next? How did you live?" "Next? After that it was just my father and me. We managed to get through the dark times, supporting each other. He did everything and more to ensure my happiness. Therefore I didn't ask him about you, fearing it would cause him pain. However, when I turned 18, he told me himself. He thought I had a right to know. Your father is a good man." "Yes, he is wonderful." Jim and Ashley sat in silence for a long while. Then Jim said regretfully, "Just think about it. We've wasted so much time." But Ashley, sitting next to her husband, placed her hand on his and gently squeezed. She looked at Misty with warmth. "Let's not regret the time we've lost. It's up to us to decide how we use the time we have now. Let's act in a way that we won't regret anything in the future." That evening, the couple invited Misty and her father to dinner before they carried on with their own tasks. Later the same evening, they gathered again at a restaurant. Misty's father, Alan Piper, turned out to be a very pleasant, cultured man. Jim watched with admiration as he displayed tender care for his daughter, his eyes warm as he watched her and looked after her needs. However, the more Jim observed his sister, the more a certain thought crept into his mind. Misty, of course, was very similar to their mother, but her green eyes speckled with gold differed entirely from their mother's gray ones and father's brown ones. They were the exact same as Jim's, and as someone else's. "Mr. Piper, may I ask you a question?" He approached Alan when the women, along with Stephanie, went to freshen up. Misty's father looked at him and smiled. "You've been watching me all evening. I would be the last fool if I didn't realize what you wanted to ask. And yes, the answer to your question is yes, it's true." Jim was taken aback. "Have you always known?" "From the very first day. After all, Natalie told me immediately, and I would have figured it out over time. But Misty doesn't know about it." He removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and continued, "If you're planning to tell her, please choose another time, not today. Of course, don't worry about it. Thank you." In Jim's eyes, Alan became even more worthy of respect. After all, he treated Misty as his own daughter, even knowing she wasn't biologically so. He provided her with a good upbringing and always gave her unconditional love. Jim looked at Alan, and his heart warmed with the knowledge that this man had provided his mother with at least some happiness in her life. Jim was profoundly grateful to him. The next day, for the first time in many years, Jim wanted to speak with his father. Walter grumbled as he rose from his chair and made his way to the front door. He was surprised that someone was knocking on his small apartment's door. The only visitors he usually had were food delivery couriers, and he was not expecting any orders, so he approached the door with a certain amount of caution. "Who's there? Please open the door." "It's me." A stunned Walter thought he heard the voice of his son. Perhaps his deep sense of guilt and desire to reconcile with his son, coupled with his inability to make the first move, were leading to such hallucinations, he thought. He took a deep breath and opened the door. In front of him stood a tall young man looking him in the eye. It really was Jim. Unable to say anything, the older man simply stepped aside, allowing his son into the apartment. Jim immediately started to ramble, not looking at his father. "Dad, I was scared that if I didn't come today, I would regret it later. I have something to tell you, and we need to sort out our relationship once and for all." "I'm sorry." "What?" Jim looked at his father and saw so much remorse and pain in his eyes that he was taken aback. He had assumed his father would argue with him in his usual stubborn, uncompromising manner or ignore him. But standing before him was an aged, hunched man with once bright green eyes that had lost their sparkle. At a single glance, it was evident that this man had been drowning in despair for years. "Please forgive me for everything, son. I owe you and your mother so much. I regret everything. How I wish I could make things right, but I fear that even if I were to live my life over, I would act just as I did before. It was only the long days of solitude that made me realize how wrong I was. I thought about calling you so many times, but I was afraid you wouldn't want to hear me. God, I'm such a coward." Jim stared at his father, who could now not stop the torrent of words he had been holding back all these years. This conversation was a long-awaited moment for Walter. Jim heard sincere words from his always stern, arrogant father for the first time. He hadn't imagined how much it would stun him. "Dad, I had no idea," he sighed. The father looked at his son with deep concern in his eyes. He knew that he had spoiled many things in their lives. "Son, you hate me, and I understand you." "I don't hate you, Dad, and we definitely will talk about this. But right now, I want to say something else. If it weren't for one circumstance, to be honest, I don't know if I would have come to see you or not." Jim faltered a little, then blurted out, "Dad, you have a daughter." Walter abruptly stopped and for the first time seemed to ponder. His heart skipped a beat and he asked to sit down. Jim told Walter everything. His first desire was to meet Alan. By the next day, he was already sitting across from him. Walter nervously fiddled with the button on his shirt sleeve. Sitting opposite Alan, he broke the lengthy silence and began to speak. "I've hated you all my life. I considered you the vile man who stole my wife." He then looked around and saw photographs of Misty. Slowly, tears began to form in his eyes. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't hold them back. Alan sat quietly, offering a weak smile. "It's okay, Walter." Alan slowly rose and walked over to Walter. He took his hand and gave him a strong embrace. Walter sobbed even more and said, "Forgive me. Thank you for everything. Thank you for raising my daughter and for becoming her real father." "Natalie never spoke ill of you, and she never held a grudge. She only remembers that you once saved her," responded Alan, his words only serving to break Walter's heart further. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," was all that Walter could repeat. Meeting Alan was a true revelation for Walter. He saw in him a man who, despite all the hardships of life, remained committed and caring. Walter realized that this was the kind of father and husband Natalie and Misty deserved. Someone capable of giving them love and support. Someone he himself could never have been for them. Walter decided not to disturb his daughter and shatter the beautiful world in which her father was Alan. It was a difficult decision to make. He did not consider himself worthy to be called her father. 6 months had passed. "Misty, why is it taking so long?" Misty was holding Stephanie on her lap, flipping through the pages of a picture book. "Jim, calm down. This isn't your first time becoming a father." "Not the first time, but this time it's different." Misty smiled. She knew the reason, but Ashley had strictly forbidden her from telling Jim. The door swung open and a nurse stepped out. "Are you still here?" Jim looked at her with wary eyes. "Don't worry, everything went well. Of course, the boys are a bit weak, but that's normal when it's twins. Everything will be fine by tomorrow." He blinked. Once, twice. Misty stifled a laugh into her fist. Jim gave her a stern look. "You knew? What a sister you are!" He then sank into his chair. "So what you're saying is, I have 2 sons?" The nurse nodded. "Exactly. Looks like your wife had a surprise for you." Jim offered a silly smile. Life is indeed full of surprises. He sprung up, wrapping everyone in a group hug. 2 sons! Wow! After returning home, the entire family hosted a grand dinner. When everyone sat down, Alan looked at his watch and stood up. He asked for everyone's attention and began to speak. I'm glad we're all here. I'm very happy for you. Jim and Ashley, I apologize for the decision I made. I invited your father, Jim. He looked at Jim and everyone fell silent. Alan hesitated. It had been difficult to keep the little truth from his daughter. He was very concerned about how Misty would react. I know he once caused Natalie a lot of pain, but he has changed and repented. We need to be forgiving and give him a second chance. Walter entered the room. Misty smiled and looked at him, but her smile vanished instantly. She stared at him intently, and slowly the realization dawned on her. Misty took a deep breath, her eyes still locked on Walter. She was silent for a moment, letting the revelation sink in. The room was heavy with tension. Everyone watched as Walter moved closer to the table. His eyes were watery, full of years of regret and longing. Hello, Misty, he said quietly. Nobody said anything. The room was silent, and everyone was waiting for Misty's reaction. I'm so sorry, Walter said, his voice barely audible. Misty felt a lump in her throat. Misty began, but words failed her. Walter seemed to understand. He offered her a sad, small smile, nodding as though he had expected this reaction. Take your time, Misty, he said. I've waited this long. I can wait a bit more. After that night, the family's dynamics slowly changed. It took time, but Misty eventually grew comfortable with Walter's presence. There were awkward moments, misunderstandings, but they worked through them, strengthening their bond day by day. Jim and Ashley's 2 healthy boys brought joy and chaos into their lives. Stephanie adored her new brothers, and the family thrived. Walter became a regular part of their lives, always a bit distant, but making an effort to be there. He had lost many years, but was determined to make the most of the time he had left. As for Alan, he watched with contentment. He had raised Misty as his own, and loved her unconditionally. Now he had the satisfaction of seeing his family complete and at peace, knowing he had made the right decisions. After a long day, Diane sat down to count her earnings. Just the day before, she was fortunate enough that her neighbor, Mrs. Tammy Lasher, had asked her to help with moving the stuff around her house. Even though the work had left her feeling exhausted, Diane found solace in the fact that she had made some extra money. Ever since Diane had moved into the room in an old house, she had known Mrs. Lasher, a businesslike woman who held a welcoming demeanor. Mrs. Lasher was a prominent figure in the local community, recognized and respected by nearly everyone. As Diane got to know her better over time, she discovered that beneath Mrs. Lasher's professional exterior lay a genuinely kind and caring individual. Her curiosity was insatiable. She had an intrinsic interest in everyone's lives, which was balanced by her generous and empathetic nature. While they were working together, Tammy turned to Diane and said, "You've been my next-door neighbor for about a year now, haven't you, Diane?" "Yes, you have quite an impressive memory, Mrs. Lasher," Diane responded. Tammy's eyes sparkled with amusement as she said, "Well, as a community representative, I try to keep track of what's happening in our neighborhood." She paused, a smile playing on her lips. "Even though you've been here for quite some time, I've only seen you a few times." Diane chuckled and replied, "That's not surprising, really. My days are filled with studying and my evenings with work. It seems like I use my place only for sleeping. Luckily, I got this room pretty cheap. Living closer to my job in the city center would be too expensive." Tammy, looking intrigued, asked, "Do your parents live in a different city?" "I'm an orphan, actually," Diane responded. Taken aback, Tammy dropped the wallpaper roll she was holding. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Diane." "No need to apologize. I've adjusted to it," Diane replied, though a hint of sadness tinged her words. Tammy sighed sympathetically. "It must be tough to feel so alone." Diane responded, "Like I said, I've grown accustomed to it. I believe my father is out there somewhere, but he abandoned me before I was even born. My mother passed away when I was very young. I don't have many memories of her, just a few old photographs." Wanting to offer some comfort, Tammy said in a sincere, caring tone, "Diane, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. It could be anything from problems with your utilities to disputes with other neighbors. I may be just a regular person, but I promise to help as best as I can. I have a few connections that could be useful." Diane offered a grateful smile and returned to her work. Once they finished moving the furniture in the living room, Mrs. Lasher commended Diane on her meticulous work. To Diane's surprise, she didn't just hand her the agreed-upon payment, but also gave her some groceries. "Take these, dear. My household can't possibly finish all of this. Despite being miles away, my son insists on ordering a lot of food for us. He's always making sure we're well fed." Feeling a wave of gratitude, Diane thanked Mrs. Lasher and got back to her own place. However, once alone, she was unable to hold back her tears. Life had been an uphill battle ever since her mother's death. The cold, impersonal environment of the orphanage had been her reality, a place devoid of warmth and love. Diane had to fight for everything she had, always maintaining an aura of discipline and composure. Her innate sense of justice, a trait that had often got her in trouble as a child, also fueled her ambition to study law. She had fought hard to gain admission into law school after high school and had been working tirelessly ever since to finance her education. That day, Mrs. Lasher's simple act of kindness had moved her deeply. It contradicted her belief that no one cared about others. On her day off, Diane found herself browsing through baby items in the store window. She knew she couldn't afford many things, but she still had 4 months to prepare. She was determined to manage it all, even though the cost of necessities like a crib and a stroller was daunting. She thought of seeking out used items online, a more affordable alternative. As for her studies, she decided to take an academic leave to dedicate herself entirely to caring for her upcoming baby. She stepped inside the store and made a modest purchase, some cozy blankets and baby onesies. As she returned home and was admiring her purchases, the doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Lasher. "Diane, dear, I noticed you coming home. I baked an apple pie today and thought you might enjoy a slice," she said. "Oh, Mrs. Lasher, you really shouldn't have. But why don't we enjoy some tea together?" Diane suggested. Tammy agreed. "Sure, why not? It's always more enjoyable together. My son Samuel is at work again." While Diane prepared the tea, Mrs. Lasher walked around the room, her attention drawn to the baby items spread out on the couch. "Diane, who Who are these for?" she asked, pointing at the new baby clothes. Feeling a blush creep up her cheeks, Diane quietly answered, "They're for my baby. I'm expecting in about 5 months." Mrs. Lasher looked at her for a moment, then asked, "And the father? I presume he's no longer in the picture?" Diane sighed. It was the first time anyone had been so direct about her ex-boyfriend, Caden. They sat down with their tea, and Mrs. Lasher said, "Listen, you don't have to discuss it if you don't want to, but if you ever need a shoulder to lean on or someone to listen, I'm here for you." Diane sighed again. She stirred her tea for a few moments, grappling with the emotions welling up inside her. Talking about it wasn't going to be easy. Diane's story began in the bustling cafe where she worked. It was a typical sunny day, with Diane flitting between tables, taking orders in her crisp uniform. The cafe, known as the Cheesecake, was a popular spot, especially on Friday evenings, brimming with lively conversations and laughter. A group of young men and women were seated at a far-off table, and Diane made her way towards them to take their order. "Why did it take you so long? We've been waiting forever," one of the girls complained, despite having just arrived a couple minutes ago. Maintaining her professional composure, Diane flashed a polite smile and apologized for the slight delay, a tactic she often used to diffuse impatient customers. However, the girl seemed adamant about making a fuss over minor details. "All right, Pia, settle down. We just got here. Don't be harsh," interjected a dark-haired guy from the group, coming to Diane's defense. He locked his gray eyes with Diane's, offering her a charming smile. Caught off guard, Diane managed to take their orders and quickly return to her duties. Yet throughout the rest of their stay, she couldn't shake off the feeling of the young man's eyes following her. As they were about to leave, the guy approached her. He introduced himself as Caden and asked for her phone number. Diane's polite refusal seemed to take him by surprise, his confident demeanor replaced by confusion, though he still looked interested. From then on, Caden became a regular at the Cheesecake Cafe. He would often bring flowers and small gifts for Diane, stop by for coffee, and patiently wait for her shift to end, all in a bid to win her over. Diane, a quiet and reserved girl, was known for her dependability and level-headedness. She was respected at the Cheesecake, her superiors appreciating her diligence and dedication to both her work and her studies. Diane was not impulsive. Rather, she preferred to think through decisions carefully. She had always thought herself capable of handling any life situation, yet Caden's persistent attention left her unprepared, and she soon found herself falling for his charm. Caden, a member of the city's privileged youth, soon became the center of Diane's world. They had only known each other for 6 months, but his conversations about their shared future felt earnest and genuine. He talked about their life after marriage, and even mentioned introducing her to his family. Diane found herself believing in his words wholeheartedly, considering herself the luckiest woman in the world. One day, she was particularly eager to meet Caden. She had been feeling under the weather for a few days, plagued by persistent nausea and fatigue. That morning, she had taken a pregnancy test, discovering that she was expecting. Initially, a wave of panic and fear washed over Diane, quickly followed by a burst of joy. The realization that she was carrying Caden's baby filled her with an undeniable euphoria. She hastily headed to see Caden at his workplace, a bright smile dancing on her face despite the turmoil of emotions within her. Excitement mixed with a tinge of worry. Was it all happening too fast? These worries, however, were overshadowed by the thought that Caden's promises were becoming a reality. They would always be together, they would raise a child, and they would be the happiest family. Recently, Caden had joined his father's business, being groomed to take over the family empire someday. As the only child of affluent parents, he was given his own office right from the start of his career, a fact he often shared with pride. Diane walked into the office building, surprised to find his secretary missing from her desk. However, her heart sank as she found Caden with his secretary, the woman perched on his desk, both of them laughing and sharing an intimate moment. As she barged in, they quickly pulled away from each other, looking surprised and guilty. "Diane, what are you doing here?" Caden stammered, looking somewhat panicked. He quickly composed himself, clearing his throat, and introduced his secretary, Gina, as his childhood friend. Taken aback, Diane pushed her feelings of unease aside. She had an important news to share, and she wouldn't let anything ruin the moment. "Caden, I have something to tell you." Caden, standing awkwardly beside Gina, said, "Diane, it can wait." Trying not to feel slighted, Diane decided that this was not the time to hold grudges. She waited for Caden to dismiss Gina, and once they were alone, she prepared herself to share the news. "So, what's the news?" Caden asked, leaning against his desk. Diane beamed at him. "Caden, you might want to sit down for this." Caden, standing tall and casual, responded. Diane just spit it out. "All right. Remember I warned you. We're going to have a baby, Caden." Surprise registered on Caden's face. He gawked at her before managing to say, "What? We? You must be mistaken. I didn't ask for this." Still smiling but feeling a pit in her stomach, Diane responded, "Caden, what are you saying? It's our baby. Yours and mine." He retorted, "Why should I be happy? I didn't plan on becoming a father anytime soon." "But Caden, you promised we'd be together always," Diane managed to say. "Us? Together? Did you think getting pregnant would force me to stay? If you thought you could trap me with a baby, you were sorely mistaken." His harsh words hit Diane like a punch. She found herself gasping for air. "Caden?" She barely managed to utter his name. Ignoring her, he headed towards the door, opening it with a loud bang. Before leaving, he turned to say, "Diane, go home. I'll call you later. I've got a meeting now. You know your way out." With tear-filled eyes, Diane watched as the door slammed shut, leaving her alone with the harsh reality. That very evening, Caden did get in touch. However, instead of offering reassurances or explanations, he demanded that Diane terminate the pregnancy. He bombarded her with similar messages over the next few days. Ultimately, Caden, barely recognizable from the man Diane thought she knew, met her one more time, this time handing her money. He said it was for taking care of the baby issue and told her to never bother him again. "Mrs. Lasher, please don't think less of me," Diane implored, her eyes pleading with the older woman. Caden's world was different from mine. It was radiant, filled with warmth and light, devoid of pain or worries, just endless celebration. He was so caring and gentle with me, promising that our life together would be nothing but joys and happiness. And I believed it all. I thought I was special, different from the others. But I was just naive and ended up getting hurt. Tammy, her eyes sympathetic, questioned, "Did you love him, Diane?" "Yes, I did. And it felt like Caden loved me too," Diane responded, her voice barely above a whisper. "But how could he love you if he treated you this way?" Tammy shook her head, her brows furrowed in confusion. Closing her eyes, Diane nodded in agreement. "I don't know, Mrs. Lasher. I truly don't know why he acted like that. Or perhaps I just don't want to admit the truth, even though deep down, I know." Tammy, after a pause, asked, "Diane, did you ever consider?" "Well, you know." Diane, looking shocked, quickly interjected, "No, absolutely not. This baby is innocent. Why would I even think of that?" "That's wonderful, Diane. You're a smart girl. Don't worry. Things will get better, I promise. You know, not everyone has the kind of strength you possess. You even have your own place to live. Let me ask around the neighborhood. Maybe someone has a baby stroller or crib they don't need anymore. Children grow up so fast, and people here respect my opinion," Tammy assured, a smile forming on her face. "I, too, felt lonely once, but I was lucky to find Ben. He was my beacon in the darkness, and we've been together for 45 years, always supporting each other. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Touched by Tammy's kindness, Diane expressed her gratitude. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Lasher. I will do my best to handle everything on my own, but knowing that I have your support certainly makes life a bit easier." Diane still had a few things to sort out, but for now, she could take a break. The most vital thing was that she had people in her life she could truly depend on. This was incredibly valuable, and everything else would sort itself out in due course. Diane now knew the path she needed to take to rebuild her life, and she was certain she would thank Mr. and Mrs. Lasher someday for their kind-heartedness. Tammy set to work preparing the house for Diane and the baby's homecoming. They were due to leave the maternity hospital the next day. Tammy started by cleaning the kitchen and bathroom, and then she sorted the groceries in the fridge. Next, she moved to Diane's bedroom and began dusting the shelves. As she brushed against the leather-bound book, it fell to the floor. It was a notebook, and when it fell open, Tammy saw a page full of neat handwriting. "Oops," Tammy said as she bent to pick it up. She noticed her own name written in the notebook. Although she felt a twinge of guilt, curiosity got the better of her, and she read the entry. Tears filled her eyes as she read Diane's heartfelt words. The diary entry revealed Diane's deep appreciation and love for the Lashers, and she wrote about praying for their well-being. When Diane and the baby arrived home in Mr. Lasher's car, he commented on the baby's name. "Levi, huh? That's a good, strong name. May he grow up to be healthy and bring joy to his mama," he said, helping Diane with the baby and their bags. "I think so too, Mr. Lasher," Diane replied, smiling at him. As Diane stepped through the front door, she was taken aback by the sight of her home. Her neighbors had outdone themselves. The house was spotless and beautifully decorated with blue balloons and white flowers. Soft music filled the air, and a mouth-watering scent of home-cooked food wafted from the kitchen. Diane was immediately swept up in Mrs. Lasher's warm embrace. Tammy planted a loud kiss on Diane's cheek and gently took the baby from her arms. The expression on Tammy's face was a mix of excitement, happiness, and perhaps a touch of nervousness. With her voice shaking slightly with excitement, she said, "Well, hello, dear." Diane returned her smile, looking a bit perplexed, and followed the couple into the room. As they sat down to talk, Ben addressed Diane in a serious tone. "Diane, we need to discuss something important with you." "Is something wrong?" Diane asked, a worried look crossing her face. Tammy quickly dismissed her husband's grave tone. "Ben, you've scared her now. Why so serious?" Then she turned to Diane, already smiling, and said, "Ben simply wanted to say that we would like to invite you to stay with us for a while. We want to be close to help you with whatever you need and offer advice when necessary." Diane stared at the couple in surprise. "Stay with you? Oh my, I don't want to be a burden." "Absolutely not," Tammy reassured her. "Our house is plenty big, and our son is away working overseas, so his room is free. We won't take no for an answer. When you feel ready and capable of taking care of yourself and Levi, you can find somewhere else if you wish." Caught up in the moment, Diane rushed forward and enveloped the couple in a tight hug. Mr. Lasher chuckled awkwardly and gently patted her back, while Mrs. Lasher held her close for a long moment. As time passed, life continued on its natural course. The baby, Levi, grew up strong and healthy, and Diane managed to find work. She returned to university and after a successful final year, graduated with distinction. Although Diane had long since moved away from the Lashers, they continued to support her as they always had. Tammy helped care for Levi until Diane found a suitable nanny. In time, Diane moved to a large city where she pursued her ambitions diligently. Her journey took her from a young, lost waitress in a cafe to a resilient, determined, and successful businesswoman. Over 8 years, Diane built her own business, providing a comfortable life for herself and Levi, complete with a lovely apartment in the city center and a car. Diane ensured Levi had a bright future, enrolling him in a highly regarded school where he soon became a top student. His life was rich and fulfilling, filled with exciting activities, sports achievements, and great times with good friends. The Lashers stayed in the same small town, their happiness complete when their son returned from abroad to run his business locally. Although he didn't live with them, he visited them often. "Darling, come take a look at this," Tammy called her husband one day, peering out the window at the street. Parked right in front of their house was a brand new black pickup truck. "This truck's been here since Saturday. I'm a bit nervous. Did you pick a fight with someone at the bar again?" "Don't be ridiculous. Of course not," her husband replied, also looking at the enormous vehicle in their driveway. "You never know who might have a bone to pick with two old folks like us." He laughed heartily at his wife's comment before returning to his comfortable chair in front of the TV. The next day, the truck remained parked in front of their house, leaving the couple uneasy. Ben wondered if it had been abandoned or perhaps stolen. In the evening, having exhausted all speculation about the mysterious truck, the doorbell rang. Tammy opened the door and gasped in surprise and delight. Standing before her was a radiant young woman, a bouquet of roses in her hands. "Surprise!" Diane announced with a radiant smile, wrapping Tammy in a warm embrace. "Oh, our dear Diane!" exclaimed the pleasantly surprised elderly woman. After a moment, she released Diane and ushered her into the house. "Honey, look who's come to see us." "Where have you been all this time, Diane?" Ben chided her later at the dinner table as he piled a heap of delicious dishes onto her plate. "Oh, lay off her, old man. Diane's a busy woman," Tammy said, jumping to Diane's defense. Ben grumbled but reached across the table to squeeze Diane's hand. "We've missed you dearly," he said, a smile softening his stern demeanor. Diane had been meaning to visit the elderly couple for some time, but her busy schedule had always seemed to get in the way. This time, she was determined to clear her calendar, postponing work and rescheduling meetings just to spend time with her cherished friends. With her son Levi on a 3-day trip with his friend's family, she had come alone. As she sat with them, catching up and watching the couple's loving banter, Diane felt a sense of immense joy. Their interaction brought back memories of the early days after Levi's birth, when a usually gruff Ben Lasher would coo over the baby, refusing to let him out of his arms. Despite Tammy's protest that he was spoiling the baby, Ben personally selected and purchased all the baby necessities, driving them over in his old car. "By the way, Mr. Lasher, what do you think of the truck?" Diane asked him casually. "What truck?" Ben responded, confused. "You didn't receive my letter?" Diane asked, surprised. The elderly couple exchanged baffled glances. "I apologize. I completely forgot to ensure you received the card and letter. That was thoughtless of me," Diane said, chiding herself. "Anyway, this is something I've been dreaming of doing for some time. It's not a grand gesture, but please accept it as a token of my gratitude." The new truck, which had been parked outside their house, was in fact a gift from Diane. She recalled a conversation from years ago when she was pregnant and juggling her job and caring for her newborn son. During a rare, unguarded moment, Mr. Lasher had voiced a quiet wish for a new vehicle to replace his beat-up old Honda, fantasizing about taking Tammy on drives in a big truck. Diane had never forgotten this, and now she had the means to make his dream come true. Mr. Lasher expressed his surprise while Tammy simply stared at Diane, her eyes wide. The generous gift had left them utterly dumbfounded. They protested, insisting they couldn't possibly accept it, but Diane stood her ground. Finally, Mr. Lasher relented, accepting the keys with a grateful nod. "We spent the entire day wondering who could have left a truck right in front of our house. Oh, Diane, you truly surprised us. We can't thank you enough." The couple beamed at each other, acknowledging that they were overwhelmed not so much by the gift itself, but by the heartfelt sentiment behind it. Absolutely, the Lashers were financially capable of purchasing a new car by themselves. Their son Samuel frequently suggested that they let go of their trusty old Honda so that he could present them with a more contemporary model. Yet the couple consistently declined his offer, favoring their old, reliable vehicle. Mr. Lasher had occasionally grumbled about the car's antiquated features and shortcomings to Diane. However, this was more out of a desire to put Diane at ease than an actual need for an upgrade. He understood the importance of keeping up appearances and often played along with complaints about their old car to match Diane's social status and make her feel comfortable. With a giddy sense of excitement, Ben drove off to take a spin around the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the women made themselves comfortable on the porch, engaging in pleasant conversation. "How have you been, dear? Your son must be quite the young man by now," Tammy asked, sipping her tea. "Everything's well, Mrs. Lasher," Diane responded, her voice somewhat robotic. "Levi, yes, he's matured a lot. He's responsible, intelligent. My rock." "And your love life?" Tammy probed. Diane looked down, her cheeks reddening slightly, prompting Tammy to arch an eyebrow in anticipation. "Well, there's someone new. He's a business partner of mine. I think he's interested in me. He's invited me to dinner several times under the pretense of discussing business, but these dinners have felt more like dates." "And?" Tammy pressed. "I don't know. I'm conflicted. He's attractive and he's incredibly gentle, respectful, caring, and witty. Our conversations are always enjoyable, but I don't want to rush things, especially considering Levi. Since when is having a child a problem? Don't miss out on happiness because of outdated norms," Tammy said sternly. After a moment's pause, Tammy sighed, adding, "Ever since my son returned, I've imagined introducing you two. You would have made a lovely pair, but it seems life has other plans." At this, Diane chuckled, leaning her head on Tammy's shoulder, comforted by her words and the warm affection she'd always shown her. When Mr. Lasher returned from his joyride, his face was aglow with happiness. He couldn't stop raving about the feeling of the truck Diane had gifted. Diane then surprised the couple once more, kindly offering them to move to her house in the city. The Lashers warmly thanked her but declined her generous offer. Our son wanted us to move with them too, but why would we need the hustle and bustle of that big city? We love it here in our snug home where we've lived our whole life, they explained. The following morning, they bid Diane goodbye, standing outside their cozy home. Promise you'll visit more often, and bring Levi with you next time, Tammy instructed, a stern look on her face replaced with a soft smile as Diane nodded, getting into her car. Back in the city, Diane delved into her work during the day and devoted her evenings to her son. However, she couldn't help but notice the increased attention from Ryan, her business partner. He'd surprise her with rare theater and opera tickets or send her favorite flowers. His knowledge of their interests amazed her, but she still hadn't revealed the most significant part of her life to him, causing her some worry. One day, she decided to address it head-on. She invited Ryan over for a coffee. "Ryan, there's something important I need to tell you," she said, looking at the smiling man sitting across from her. Ryan's smile vanished as he responded, "Yes, Diane, I'm listening." Gathering her courage, Diane began to speak. "Ryan, before things get any deeper, I want to let you know that Ryan interrupted her. "You don't really like me." Diane felt a rush of warmth spread across her cheeks and she quickly set things straight. No, that's not it at all. I actually like you a lot." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, leaving her surprised at her own boldness. A moment of silence ensued as she processed what she had just confessed. She felt an uncomfortable pang of anxiety, unsure of how she would react. Trying to break the tension, she nervously laughed and tried to lighten the mood. "Well, that came out faster than I thought it would." Ryan exhaled, visibly relieved. "So what's the matter then?" "I have a son. He's 8 years old. You're a successful, handsome young man with a bright future ahead. You could be with anyone you choose, someone perhaps more suitable. Why would you choose a single mother when you could find someone younger, someone without baggage?" "Is that all you want me to be aware of before we proceed?" Ryan asked, his gaze fixed on Diane. "I just want to make sure my son isn't seen as a burden," Diane replied, her voice laden with concern. "He means the world to me." Ryan considered her for a moment before exhaling deeply. "Do you remember the first time we met at the business center? I was so taken by you, so captivated by your presence that I barely heard a word you were saying about our potential partnership. My team had to fill me in later. That night, I wanted to learn everything about you, and it was the same night I discovered about Levi." Diane stared at him, her expression a blend of astonishment and disbelief. "But what I couldn't have imagined back then was how much I'd grow to love your son," Ryan continued. "At first, I was just curious about the two of you, so I arranged to meet Levi. Then I found myself eagerly attending his sports games and hanging out with him and his friends. Eventually, I confessed to him that I had feelings for his mother, and I asked if I could court you. He gave me his blessing." Diane's mouth fell open in shock. "What?" "I apologize," Ryan hurriedly added. "I should have discussed it with you first. I hope you're not angry." Diane was stunned. In retrospect, she realized there had been signs. The sudden appearance of toys she wouldn't normally buy, Levi's unexplained outgoings to play with the local boys, even when they hardly knew any kids in the neighborhood. But she never suspected that Ryan was behind it all. At first, she felt a flash of anger, more directed at Levi for his little secret. But as she locked eyes with Ryan, seeing his sincere and hopeful look, her anger melted away to be replaced by a tender smile. She was looking at someone who genuinely cared for her and her son, something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. While there were other men who'd shown interest in her over the years, none had managed to win the trust of both her and Levi. And so, after 9 years of putting up walls, Diane let herself embrace the possibility of love, not just for her, but for her son as well. She opened her heart to a new relationship, one that included both her and Levi. Diane's life began to burst with vibrant hues. Ryan's care and affection filled each day with a newfound joy. And it wasn't just Diane who loved him. Her son Levi adored them too, seeing in Ryan a best friend and a role model. One day, Ryan suggested introducing Diane to his parents. He planned a dinner at an upscale restaurant to make the occasion extra special.
The evening arrived, and Diane, along with Ryan and Levi, awaited his parents, who were running a bit late. The anticipation made Diane jittery. This was a significant milestone in their relationship. An elderly couple walked into the restaurant, and Ryan greeted them with a warm smile, guiding them towards their table. Diane's eyes widened in disbelief. It was Tammy and Ben Lashers, the kind-hearted couple she'd come to cherish. Her heart fluttered as she recognized them, a wave of astonishment washing over her. The realization that her lover's parents were also people she held dear was nothing short of extraordinary. The elderly couple, equally surprised, barely had time to react before Diane, Levi, and the Lashers enveloped each other in a round of joyous hugs, laughter, and happy tears. The surprise reunion left Ryan utterly perplexed until it dawned on him. Diane was the same woman his mother had been trying to introduce him to, a suggestion he had always shrugged off, confident in his choice. The irony of the situation was too amusing for words. The evening unfolded into a splendid affair, filled with animated laughter and heartfelt conversations. Tammy and Ben regaled everyone with tales from Ryan's youth, while Ryan reveled in Diane's delighted reactions. The dinner marked not just the blending of their lives, but also the convergence of past connections and future possibilities, all woven into a beautiful tapestry of shared love and joy. Diane listened intently as her future husband spoke fondly of his parents, expressing his admiration and pride in them. Levi, too, reveled in the warmth of the company, where love flowed freely towards him. As the evening wound down, after everyone had savored the sumptuous meal and shared engaging conversations, Tammy clasped Diane's hand affectionately and said, "We're so grateful to have you in our lives, dear. You've always been like a daughter to us," before enveloping her in a warm embrace. Diane was overcome with emotions. She felt a wave of happiness and gratitude for the unforgettable evening, the opportunity to meet her future in-laws, and the precious gift life had bestowed upon her, a family that she was now a part of. Following dinner, Ryan insisted on driving his parents home, brushing aside their protests. Meanwhile, Diane and Levi hailed a cab, with Ryan promising to catch up with them soon. As the taxi driver awaited his passengers, a radiant Diane bid her goodbyes to the Lashers on the street. Ryan then opened the car door for Diane and Levi, promising, "I'll be with you soon." After kissing Diane and tussling Levi's hair, he shut the door. "So, where can I take you tonight?" asked the taxi driver. Diane relayed the address, and the driver felt a stir of recognition at the sound of her voice. "No, can't be," he thought to himself as he started the car. He donned his hat and couldn't resist stealing a glance in the rearview mirror. There they were, those familiar green eyes. He fought an internal battle, but his suspicions solidified. It was indeed Diane in the backseat, the very same Diane he had abandoned pregnant 9 years ago. But now she was unrecognizable, impeccably groomed, fashionable, exuding an air of confidence that spoke volumes of her strength and resilience. It was evident that she had weathered the storm and emerged triumphant. Overcome with embarrassment and a whirlwind of emotions, Caden carried on driving, occasionally stealing glances at the woman in his rearview mirror. His gaze then drifted to the boy sitting next to her. As he maneuvered through the city's traffic, he found himself drawn to the boy's features. Eventually, he ceased looking and his eyes welled up with tears. He was transported back to the days when he was carefree, living a luxurious life on his parents' money. But life had a way of humbling people, and he was now an ordinary man, eking out a living as a cab driver. They reached their destination. As Levi got out of the cab, Diane lingered behind to settle the fare. Caden felt too embarrassed to lift his gaze from under his hat. Diane noticed the driver avoiding her gaze. At first, she thought it odd, but then she took a second look and recognized the familiar contours of his face. "Caden, is that you?" she asked. Slowly, Caden looked up, his eyes brimming with tears. For a moment they locked eyes, and Diane's heart stuttered as she remembered how a decade ago she had pleaded with those same eyes. After a brief silence, Caden managed to stammer, "Hello, Diane. I'm so sorry. You hurt me, but I survived. I wish you happiness. I've forgiven you." With those words, Diane handed Caden all the cash she had in her wallet and stepped out of the cab. She took Levi's hand and they made their way towards their home. "Mom, was that someone you know?" Levi asked, noticing that his mother had lingered in the cab. "No, sweetheart. Just someone who could use a generous tip."
Der Sturm kam aus dem Nichts. Gerade noch schien die Sonne durch mein Küchenfenster, dann verdunkelte sich der Himmel binnen Sekunden. Ich stand am Herd und rührte in der Gemüsesuppe, als das erste Donnergrollen die Scheiben erzittern ließ. Tilda, meine Dreijährige, zuckte zusammen und klammerte sich an mein Bein. Keine Angst, Schatz. Das ist nur der Donner, beruhigte ich sie, während ich ihr übers Haar strich. In diesem Moment klingelte es Sturm an der Tür. Ich wusste sofort, wer das war: Brigitte und Gustav, meine Schwiegereltern. Sie wohnten 2 Häuser weiter und suchten bei jedem Unwetter Zuflucht bei uns. Nicht, weil ihr Haus weniger sturmsicher war, sondern weil Brigitte jede Gelegenheit nutzte, um nach dem Rechten zu sehen. »Jara, Liebes! Schnell, lass uns rein«, rief Brigitte durch die geschlossene Tür. Ich atmete tief durch und öffnete. »Welch ein Unwetter«, rauschte Brigitte herein, gefolgt von Gustav, der wie üblich nur stumm nickte. Ihre Augen schweiften sofort prüfend durch die Küche. »Oh, du kochst? Hoffentlich nichts zu Experimentelles. Leon braucht nach der Arbeit etwas Ordentliches im Magen.« Ich biss mir auf die Lippe. Meine Gemüsesuppe war alles andere als experimentell, aber in Brigittes Augen war alles suspekt, was nicht nach ihren Rezepten gekocht wurde. »Wo steckt eigentlich Leon?«, fragte Gustav, während er sich am Küchentisch niederließ. »Er müsste jeden Moment kommen«, antwortete ich automatisch, obwohl ich seit Stunden nichts von ihm gehört hatte. Wieder einmal. Ein greller Blitz erhellte die Küche, gefolgt von ohrenbetäubendem Donner. Tilda weinte leise. Ich nahm sie auf den Arm und wiegte sie sanft, während Brigitte anfing, in meinen Töpfen zu rühren. »Die Suppe ist zu dünn«, verkündete sie. »Soll ich dir zeigen, wie man…« Das Telefon unterbrach sie. Leons Nummer. Mit klopfendem Herzen ging ich ran. »Schatz, tut mir leid«, sagte er hastig. »Ich schaffe es heute nicht zum Abendessen. Ein wichtiger Termin ist dazwischen gekommen.« Ich spürte Brigittes und Gustavs Blicke im Rücken. »Was für ein Termin?«, fragte ich leise. »Kann ich jetzt nicht erklären. Bis später.« Er legte auf, bevor ich antworten konnte. Draußen tobte der Sturm, aber die eisige Kälte, die sich in meinem Magen ausbreitete, hatte nichts mit dem Wetter zu tun. Es war nicht das erste Mal, dass Leon sich seltsam verhielt. Aber diesmal war etwas anders. In seiner Stimme lag etwas, das ich noch nie gehört hatte. Angst. Nach dem Sturm lag eine seltsame Stille über dem Haus. Brigitte und Gustav waren gegangen, Tilda schlief endlich, und ich saß allein in der Küche. Die Bankauszüge vor mir erzählten eine Geschichte, die ich nicht hören wollte. Regelmäßige Abhebungen, immer die gleiche Summe, immer donnerstags. Heute war Donnerstag. Das Geräusch eines Schlüssels in der Tür ließ mich zusammenzucken. Leon trat ein, durchnässt vom Regen, seine Aktentasche fest umklammert. »Du bist noch wach.« Er klang überrascht, fast erschrocken. »Deine Eltern waren hier«, sagte ich und beobachtete seine Reaktion genau. »Sie haben sich Sorgen gemacht.« Typisch. Er lockerte seine Krawatte. »Tut mir leid wegen vorhin. Der Termin.« »Was für ein Termin, Leon?« Er erstarrte kurz, fing sich aber schnell. »Nur was Geschäftliches. Nichts Wichtiges.« Um 8 Uhr abends? Im Regen. Er ging zum Kühlschrank, vermied meinen Blick. »Manchmal läuft es eben später. Du kennst das doch.« Ich schob ihm einen der Kontoauszüge zu. »Und diese Abhebungen? Auch nichts Wichtiges.« Das Klirren der Bierflasche, die seiner Hand entglitt, hallte durch die Küche. Er fing sie gerade noch auf. »Du schnüffelst in unseren Konten.« »Unseren Konten? Interessant, dass du das jetzt betonst. Sonst heißt es immer nur dein Konto, dein Geld.« Er stellte die Flasche ab, seine Hände zitterten leicht. »Jara, bitte. Es ist spät, ich bin müde.« 2.000 €. Jeden Monat. Seit einem Jahr. Das sind Geschäftsausgaben. Späßen. Dann zeig mir die Belege. Stille. Nur das Tropfen seiner nassen Kleidung auf den Küchenboden. »Es ist kompliziert«, sagte er schließlich. »Nein, Leon. Kompliziert ist es, wenn man nicht weiß, ob man rot oder blau anziehen soll. Das hier.« Ich deutete auf die Auszüge. »Das ist etwas anderes.« Er machte einen Schritt auf mich zu, hielt dann inne. »Was willst du damit sagen?« »Das fragst du mich? Wirklich?« Ich stand auf, die Papiere in der Hand. »Weißt du, was das Schlimmste ist? Nicht das Geld. Nicht mal die Lügen. Sondern dass du glaubst, ich wäre zu dumm, es zu merken.« Er öffnete den Mund, schloss ihn wieder. Dann griff er nach seiner Aktentasche. Ich schlafe heute im Gästezimmer. Als er ging, fiel etwas aus seiner Tasche. Ein Briefumschlag. Ich wartete, bis seine Schritte verklungen waren, bevor ich ihn aufhob. Darin war ein Foto. Eine Frau mit einem kleinen Jungen, vielleicht 5 Jahre alt. Auf der Rückseite stand in Leons Handschrift: Es tut mir so leid. Die ganze Nacht hatte ich das Foto angestarrt. Der kleine Junge hatte Leons Augen, dieselbe Form, dieselbe Farbe. Unmöglich zu übersehen. Als der Morgen dämmerte, wusste ich, was ich tun musste. Ich fahre kurz einkaufen, rief ich Leon zu, der noch im Gästezimmer war. Keine Antwort. Tilda ließ ich bei Brigitte, die überraschend bereitwillig zusagte. Vielleicht spürte sie, dass etwas nicht stimmte. Ihr prüfender Blick folgte mir, als ich ging. Die Adresse auf der Rückseite des Fotos führte zu einem gepflegten Reihenhaus am Stadtrand. Mein Herz hämmerte, als ich auf die Klingel starrte. M. Weber stand dort. Ich drückte. Eine Frau öffnete. Dieselbe wie auf dem Foto, nur älter. Sie musterte mich verwirrt. Kann ich Ihnen helfen? Ich zog das Foto hervor. Ihre Augen weiteten sich, dann wurde ihr Gesicht hart. Sie sind Yaras Frau. Nicht Leons Frau. Yaras Frau. Die Worte trafen mich wie ein Schlag. Wie lange? Fragte ich nur. Sie seufzte, trat zur Seite. Kommen Sie rein. Das sollten Sie besser sitzen hören. Die Küche war hell und freundlich. Kinderzeichnungen an den Wänden. Ein halb aufgegessenes Frühstück auf dem Tisch. Mama? Wer ist das? Der Junge vom Foto stand in der Tür. Älter jetzt, aber unverkennbar Leons Sohn. Geh in dein Zimmer, Jonas, sagte sie sanft. Er gehorchte widerwillig. Er ist 7, sagte sie, als er weg war. Leon und ich waren zusammen, bevor er sie kennenlernte. Als ich schwanger wurde. Sie verstummte. Hat er sie verlassen? Ein bitteres Lachen. Nein. Er hat geheiratet, sie. Aber er ist nie wirklich gegangen. Die monatlichen Zahlungen. Die späten Termine. Alles ergab plötzlich Sinn. Seine Eltern, begann ich. Wissen Bescheid. Von Anfang an. Sie dachten, eine neue Frau würde ihn zur Vernunft bringen. Sie schüttelte den Kopf. Tut mir leid. Das hätte ich nicht sagen sollen. Draußen hupte ein Auto. Jonas rief, Papa ist da. Wir erstarrten beide. Schritte auf dem Kiesweg. Der Hinterausgang, flüsterte sie hastig. Durch die Küche, dann links. Ich rannte. Hinter mir hörte ich die Haustür aufgehen, Leons Stimme, Hey, Champion. Erst in meinem Auto, 3 Straßen weiter, ließ ich die Tränen kommen. Nicht aus Trauer. Aus Wut. Sie hatten alle gelogen. Leon, seine Eltern, jahrelang. Und ich? Ich war nur der Versuch gewesen, ein Problem zu lösen. Mein Handy vibrierte. Eine Nachricht von Leon. Wo bist du? Wir müssen reden. Ja, das mussten wir wohl. Aber diesmal würde ich die Bedingungen stellen. Finn öffnete mir die Tür, bevor ich klingeln konnte. Ein Blick in mein Gesicht genügte. Komm rein, sagte er nur und führte mich in seine Küche. Der vertraute Geruch von frischem Kaffee und seinem selbstgebackenen Brot umhüllte mich wie eine Decke. Du siehst aus, als hättest du ein Gespenst gesehen. Schlimmer. Ich legte das Foto auf den Tisch. Ich habe die Wahrheit gesehen. Finn studierte das Bild, sein Gesicht wurde hart. Wann hast du das gefunden? Gestern. Aber das ist nicht alles. Ich erzählte ihm von meinem Besuch bei Marisa Weber, von Jonas, von Brigittes und Gustavs Mitwisserschaft. Diese manipulativen. Er unterbrach sich, atmete tief durch. Was willst du jetzt tun? Leon will reden. Natürlich will er das. Finn schnaubte. Jetzt, wo er aufgeflogen ist. Mein Handy vibrierte erneut. Leon. Ich schob es weg. Da ist noch mehr, sagte Finn plötzlich, sein Ton seltsam vorsichtig. Was meinst du? Er zögerte. Erinnerst du dich an die Kunstgalerie, die deine Bilder ablehnte? Vor 2 Jahren. Natürlich erinnerte ich mich. Es war meine große Chance gewesen, endlich als Künstlerin Fuß zu fassen. Die Galerie gehört Gustavs Golfpartner, sagte Finn leise. Ich habe es letzte Woche zufällig herausgefunden. Die Tasse in meiner Hand zitterte. Sie haben es sabotiert. Vermutlich wollten sie nicht, dass du zu unabhängig wirst. Eine erfolgreiche Karriere hätte ihre perfekte Familienkonstruktion gestört. Wut stieg in mir auf, heiß und verzehrend. Sie hatten nicht nur zugesehen, wie Leon ein Doppelleben führte. Sie hatten aktiv dafür gesorgt, dass ich abhängig blieb. »Was ist mit Tilda?« fragte Finn sanft. »Tilda. Meine kleine Tochter, die nichts von alledem ahnte. Die ihren Vater liebte und von ihren Großeltern verwöhnt wurde. Sie verdient die Wahrheit«, sagte ich schließlich. »Vielleicht nicht jetzt, aber eines Tages. Und du verdienst Gerechtigkeit.« Mein Handy vibrierte wieder. Diesmal war es Brigitte. »Wir müssen reden. Es ist nicht so, wie du denkst.« Ich lachte bitter. »Oh, ich denke, es ist genau so, wie ich denke. Sogar schlimmer.« Finn nahm meine Hand. »Was ist dein Plan?« Ein Lächeln breitete sich auf meinem Gesicht aus. »Weißt du was? Ich glaube, es wird Zeit für eine Vernissage. Eine sehr persönliche.« Die Vernissage war in vollem Gange. Ich stand zwischen meinen neuesten Werken, großformatige Porträts einer zerbrochenen Familie. Brigittes dominantes Gesicht, in dunklen Farben gehalten, ihre Augen kalt und berechnend. Gustav im Schatten, ein schwacher Mann, der wegschaut. Und Leon, gespalten in der Mitte, 2 Leben, 2 Familien. »Das ist Wahnsinn«, flüsterte Finn neben mir. »Sie werden gleich hier sein.« Die Galerie füllte sich mit der lokalen Kunstszene, darunter auch Gustavs Golfpartner, der meine Bilder vor 2 Jahren abgelehnt hatte. Er erbleichte, als er mich sah. Mein Handy vibrierte. Eine Nachricht von Marisa. »Ich verstehe jetzt, warum Sie das tun. Aber denken Sie an die Kinder.« Die Kinder. Tilda war bei meinen Eltern, sicher vor dem Sturm, der gleich losbrechen würde. Und Jonas? Er würde seinen Vater heute von einer ganz anderen Seite kennenlernen. Die Eingangstür öffnete sich. Leon trat ein, gefolgt von seinen Eltern. Sie erstarrten beim Anblick der Bilder. »Yara«, guckt Bridget. »Was soll das werden?« »Kunst«, sagte ich ruhig. »Ehrliche Kunst. Zum ersten Mal.« Leon ging auf das Hauptbild zu. Ein Porträt von ihm selbst, umgeben von Geldscheinen und zerrissenen Familienfotos. Seine Hände zitterten. »Du kannst das nicht machen«, flüsterte er. »Denk an meinen Ruf, an die Firma.« »Deinen Ruf.« Ich lachte bitter. Den hättest du bedenken sollen, bevor du 2 Familien gegründet hast. Die Galeriebesucher tuschelten, Handys wurden gezückt. Brigittes perfekte Maske bröckelte. »Lass uns das privat besprechen«, zischte sie. »Wir können dir alles erklären. Wie ihr meine Karriere sabotiert habt? Oder wie ihr zugesehen habt, während euer Sohn 2 Leben führte?« Gustav trat vor. »Es war zu deinem Besten. Du verstehst nicht.« »Oh, ich verstehe perfekt.« Ich deutete auf die Bilder. »Das ist meine Geschichte. Meine Wahrheit. Und diesmal könnt ihr sie nicht wegschließen oder zum Schweigen bringen.« Leon griff nach meinem Arm. »Bitte, Yara. Ich liebe dich doch.« Ich entzog mich seinem Griff. Welche Yara? Die Ehefrau für die Öffentlichkeit? Oder die Künstlerin, die ihr klein halten wolltet? In diesem Moment betrat eine weitere Person die Galerie. Marissa. Mit Jonas an der Hand. Die Zeit schien stillzustehen. Leon wurde blass, Brigitte schwankte. »Du hast recht«, sagte Marisa laut. »Es ist Zeit für die Wahrheit. Für alle.« Die Galerie explodierte in Chaos. Kameras blitzten, Stimmen überschlugen sich. Jonas stand wie versteinert, sein Blick zwischen Leon und mir hin und her wandernd. »Papa!« Seine kleine Stimme durchschnitt den Tumult. »Ist das die andere Frau aus deinen Geschichten?« Leon fiel auf die Knie. »Jonas, bitte. Marisa, bring ihn hier raus.« »Nein«, sagte Marisa fest. »Keine Lügen mehr. Keine Geheimnisse.« Brigitte drängte sich nach vorne. »Das ist eine private Angelegenheit. Die Ausstellung ist beendet.« »Nichts ist beendet«, rief ich, aber meine Stimme zitterte. Der Raum drehte sich. All diese Menschen, all diese Augen. Was hatte ich getan? »Yara«, Finn griff nach meinem Arm. Dein Gesicht ist kreidebleich. Ein Journalist schob sich durch die Menge. Frau Weber, stimmt es, dass Sie von der Affäre Ihres Mannes wussten? Affäre. Marisa lachte bitter. Ich war zuerst da. Fragen Sie seine Eltern. Gustav trat vor. Genug. Leon, wir gehen. Sofort. Niemand geht, sagte ich schwach. Nicht bevor. Der Rest des Satzes verschwand in Dunkelheit. Meine Beine gaben nach. Das Letzte, was ich sah, war Jonas, der sich an Marisas Bein klammerte, mit Tränen in den Augen. Als ich aufwachte, lag ich auf einer Couch im Büro der Galerie. Finn hielt meine Hand, Leon kniete neben mir. Die Besucher sind weg, sagte Finn sanft. Marisa hat Jonas nach Hause gebracht. Tilda, flüsterte ich. Ich muss zu Tilda. Du gehst nirgendwo hin, sagte Leon. Nicht in diesem Zustand. Yara, was du getan hast. Was ich getan habe. Ich setzte mich auf, zu schnell. Der Raum schwankte. Du hast 2 Familien zerstört, und ich bin die Böse. Niemand sagt das, begann er, aber ich unterbrach ihn. Deine Mutter hat gerade draußen verkündet, dass ich psychisch instabil sei. Dass die Bilder Wahnvorstellungen seien. Fingflutsterleische. Das erklärt die Reporter draußen. Reporter. Panik stieg in mir auf. Was hatte ich angerichtet? Tilda würde das alles eines Tages sehen, lesen, verstehen. Es gibt einen Ausweg, sagte Leon leise. Wenn du die Bilder zurückziehst, die Geschichte für einen nervlichen Zusammenbruch erklärst. Meine Eltern haben Verbindungen. Wir können das vertuschen. Ich starrte ihn an. Nach allem, was passiert war, versuchte er immer noch, die perfekte Fassade zu wahren. Weißt du was? Sagte ich und stand auf, diesmal langsamer. Vielleicht habe ich wirklich einen Zusammenbruch. Aber wenigstens bin ich nicht die, die sich selbst verloren hat. Eine Woche nach der Vernissage stand Brigitte vor meiner Tür. Allein, ohne ihre übliche selbstbewusste Haltung. Darf ich reinkommen? Ich trat zur Seite, führte sie in die Küche. Die gleiche Küche, in der alles begann. Tilda spielte im Nebenzimmer, ihre fröhliche Stimme ein seltsamer Kontrast zu der Spannung zwischen uns. Die Zeitungen, begann Brigitte. Sind mir egal, unterbrach ich sie. Mir nicht. Sie holte tief Luft. Ich bin hier, um dir etwas zu zeigen. Sie zog einen alten Brief aus ihrer Tasche. Vergilbt, die Ränder ausgefranst. Das habe ich vor 30 Jahren geschrieben. An meine Schwester. Ich wusste nicht, dass du eine Schwester hast. Hatte, korrigierte sie. Sie ist gegangen. Wegen einer ähnlichen Situation. Ihre Hände zitterten. Meine Eltern haben sie vor die Wahl gestellt, Familie oder Karriere. Sie wählte die Karriere. Ich nahm den Brief. Die Worte einer jüngeren Brigitte sprangen mir entgegen. Mama und Papa haben recht. Familie ist alles. Ich werde es besser machen. Als Leon von Marisa schwanger wurde, fuhr Brigitte fort, sah ich meine Chance. Den perfekten Sohn zu formen, die perfekte Familie zu schaffen. Sie lachte bitter. Stattdessen habe ich alles kaputt gemacht. Warum erzählst du mir das? Weil ich verstehe, was du getan hast. Die Ausstellung. Sie war brutal, aber ehrlich. Sie sah mich direkt an. Wie meine Schwester. Tilda kam hereingetapst, ihr Lieblingsbuch in der Hand. Brigittes Augen füllten sich mit Tränen. Gustav und ich. Wir haben Leon in dieses Leben gezwungen. Aus Angst. Aus falsch verstandener Liebe. Sie strich Tilda übers Haar. Aber du? Du hast den Mut, den ich nie hatte. Was willst du damit sagen? Die Galerie gehört jetzt dir. Ich habe sie gekauft. Tu damit, was du willst. Sie stand auf. Und Yara? Meine Schwester lebt in Paris. Sie hat eine erfolgreiche Kunstgalerie. Ich denke, ihr solltet euch kennenlernen. Sie ging zur Tür, drehte sich noch einmal um. Leon ist bei Marisa eingezogen. Es war seine Entscheidung. Die erste, die wirklich seine eigene war. Als sie weg war, hielt ich Tilda fest im Arm. Der Brief lag noch auf dem Tisch, eine Erinnerung daran, wie Generationen von Angst und Kontrolle uns alle gefangen gehalten hatten. Aber nicht mehr. Ein Jahr später stand ich wieder in einer Galerie, diesmal in Paris. Meine neue Ausstellung, Zerbrochene Spiegel, wurde in wenigen Minuten eröffnet. Tilda spielte mit Jonas in einer Ecke. Sie hatten sich auf Anhieb verstanden, als wären sie schon immer Geschwister gewesen. Marisa trat neben mich, betrachtete das Hauptwerk. Ein großes Triptychon, das eine Familie in verschiedenen Stadien des Zerbrechens und Heilens zeigte. Er würde stolz auf dich sein, sagte sie leise. Ich nickte. Leon war vor 2 Monaten bei einem Autounfall ums Leben gekommen, kurz nachdem er endlich begonnen hatte, Therapie zu machen. Das letzte Mal, als ich ihn sah, hatte er anders gewirkt, klarer, ehrlicher. Brigittes Schwester Charlotte, meine Mentorin und Galeristin, kam mit 2 Gläsen Champagner. Die ersten treffen ein. Bereit. Fast. Ich ging zu meiner Tasche und holte Leons letzten Brief hervor. Er war mit dem Testament gekommen. Ein Geständnis, eine Entschuldigung, ein Vermächtnis. Liebe Yara, stand dort, ich habe mein ganzes Leben damit verbracht, anderen gerecht zu werden. Erst meinen Eltern, dann 2 Familien. Dabei habe ich vergessen, mir selbst treu zu sein. Du hattest den Mut, die Wahrheit zu zeigen, auch wenn sie hässlich war. Verzeih mir, dass ich diesen Mut erst jetzt finde. Finn erschien mit Gustav und Brigitte. Sie hatten sich verändert im letzten Jahr, weicher geworden, echter. Brigitte umarmte Marisa, eine Geste, die vor einem Jahr undenkbar gewesen wäre. Die Bilder sind kraftvoll, sagte Gustav. Sie erzählen nicht nur von Schmerz, sondern auch von Heilung. Tilda rannte zu mir, zeigte stolz ihre neueste Zeichnung. 2 Häuser, verbunden durch eine Brücke. Das sind wir alle, verkündete sie strahlend. Ich hängte die Zeichnung neben das letzte Bild der Ausstellung. Es zeigte eine Frau, die aus zerbrochenen Spiegeln ein neues Mosaik schuf. In den Scherben spiegelten sich verschiedene Gesichter. Leon, Marisa, Jonas, Tilda, Brigitte, Gustav, Finn. Alle Teil einer Geschichte, die anders endete als erwartet. Charlotte läutete dezent eine Glocke. Es ist Zeit. Ich sah noch einmal auf Leons Brief, dann faltete ich ihn zusammen und steckte ihn weg. Seine letzten Worte würden mich immer begleiten. Du hast mir beigebracht, dass wahre Familie nicht aus perfekten Lügen besteht, sondern aus ehrlichen Wahrheiten. Das ist dein Geschenk an uns alle. Die Türen öffneten sich. Eine neue Geschichte begann.